The committee will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for my opening statement. I would like to start by acknowledging the important bipartisan work that the members of this committee did on the Postal Service Reform Act, and thank Mr. Comer and the Republicans on this committee. And this will be signed into law tomorrow by the President of the United States. Today, I hope we can come together on another common sense step, cutting our reliance on fossil fuel and saving money in the long run by transitioning to an electric postal fleet. Just yesterday, the United Nations issued a major scientific new report warning that without immediate action, shifting from fossil fuels, we will not be able to keep a global warming to acceptable levels. This Congress must help the world avert a climate disaster by moving from gas guzzlers to electric vehicles now. The Postal Service operates an aging fleet of roughly 230,000 vehicles, many of which need to be replaced. These old postal trucks are often unsafe, have high maintenance costs, and get terrible gas mileage at a time when we cannot afford to continue polluting our environment. The Postal Service began the process of acquiring a new and improved fleet more than 7 years ago. Last year, they finally selected a contractor, Oshkosh Defense, to build the new generation delivery vehicle. The Postal Service signed a 10-year contract to order up to 165,000 vehicles. Under the contract, Oshkosh must provide either internal combustion engine or battery electric vehicles in whatever amounts the Postal Service orders. Unfortunately, the Postal Service has stated that only 10% of the vehicles it purchases under the contract will be electric, while the remaining 90%, up to 148,000 vehicles, will be gas guzzlers. This is simply unacceptable. 19 of the hottest years on record have occurred since 2000. Extreme weather events are getting more frequent. One of the most important steps we can take is to reduce the amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere by burning less oil and gas. Cutting our dependence on fossil fuels is also a national security imperative. With Russia using oil sales to fund its brutal war in Ukraine, and Putin's price hikes hurting Americans at the pump, there has never been a better or more important time to invest in clean energy. This is why the Biden administration is working to move the country beyond fossil fuels and meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement. Transitioning to electric vehicles using proven technology that is already on the road today is a key part of that effort, and the Postal Service should lead the way. Electrifying its fleet would also keep the Postal Service competitive. EVs cost less to fuel up and to maintain over the life of the vehicle. So buying electric vehicles could save the Postal Service money over time, even if the upfront price is a little higher. Major companies, from UPS to Amazon, have announced plans to adopt all electric fleets, but not mostly affect electric fleets. They're not talking about partly. They're saying GM says that they are moving to an all-electric fleet. And car companies from Volkswagen to Ford have committed to ramping up production of electric vehicles in the coming years. For months, the Postal Service claimed that it could buy no more than 5,000 electric vehicles with its current funds, a tiny fraction of its overall purchase. But after this committee raised questions about the Postal Service's environmental review, they changed their position and announced they were doubling the initial order of EVs to 10,000. But it's not enough. This is progress, but these EVs still are only 20% of the initial order. And according to the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, which is here today, they currently are reviewing this matter. The Postal Service may be basing its estimates about the cost of EVs on faulty assumptions. In their written submission to the committee, GAO states that their preliminary analysis, quote, raises questions, end quote, about these estimates. In particular, GAO found that the Postal Service used a gas price of $2.19 per gallon that bears no relationship to the reality of current prices, which are well over $4 and much higher in some states. And they predicted that maintenance would be more expensive for an electric vehicle than a gas vehicle, even though the evidence shows just the opposite is true. And if you talk to anyone who knows an electric car, they say there's practically no maintenance costs. Clearly, the Postal Service needs to reevaluate its assumptions. And the Postal Service should also be doing more to buy more EVs now, including both next-generation vehicles and commercially available off-the-shelf models. The Postal Service currently has $23 billion of cash on hand, the most in years. And the bipartisan bill I led with my friend, Ranking Member Comer, provided $50 billion in financial relief over the next 10 years. A small portion of those funds can be used responsibly to buy more EVs. I also believe Congress should provide additional funding to ensure an all-electric postal fleet and be a good example to the country. And this committee approved that funding last year in the Build Back Better bill. We are now looking at a smaller scaled down Build Back Better bill, and the funding for the additional postal EVs could be in that bill. Finally, the Postal Service can reduce upfront costs for charging infrastructure by exploring partnership with private companies as well as public-facing charging stations that could increase Postal Service revenue. President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure bill also includes funding for a national network of charging stations, some of which could be located at the Postal Service, over 31,000 post offices across this country, many near highways, many in rural areas that need these charging stations. This should be looked at and explored. Electric vehicles are the vehicles of the future. To continue purchasing gas-guzzling vehicles is not only bad for the environment, it's bad for the Postal Service, it's bad for its customers, and it's bad for America. It's bad for national security policy. It is a bad policy decision. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Comer. I thank him for the leadership he provided in passing the postal reform bill, and he's now recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, for holding a hearing today. Madam Chair, you and I just spent a year doing what everyone thought was impossible in crafting a postal reform bill that would actually become law, and we succeeded. The agreement worked in large part because, for once, we had a Postmaster General who actually had a plan for reform, a plan to do what Congress could never do, fix the Postal Service's broken business model. And my support and the support of many Republicans, in fact, over half of our Republican conference, depended on Congress giving that plan a chance to succeed. But the bill isn't even the law yet, and Democrats are going back on the deal. They want to mandate the Postal Service buy at least 75% electric vehicles to be a guinea pig for their radical Green New Deal agenda. In keeping with the majority's pattern in this Congress, today's hearing is about how to spend more money instead of saving more money. That's going to change next January. Mark my word. While Republicans are not against the Postal Service acquiring electric vehicles, we are against mandates that ignore the business needs and the financial situation of the Postal Service. Republicans believe the Postal Service must be self-funded. This means the Postal Service should pay for its own capital needs, like purchasing new vehicles. Meanwhile, Americans can't afford to fill up their gas tanks, let alone buy an electric vehicle. But that isn't stopping Democrats from demanding your mailman has one. There are many problems with the Democrats' plan, but one could be to access the critical element needed to produce the electric vehicle batteries. And the president's own son has made it more difficult to do that. Hunter Biden. In 2016, Hunter Biden orchestrated the transfer of an African cobalt mine from an American company to a Chinese company, CEFC China Energy, dealing a severe blow to America's access to cobalt. Cobalt is one of the most important components of electric car batteries, solar panels, and other forms of renewable energy. And the United States is losing to China in a contest to secure cobalt. This is a national security threat and a blow to America's ability to lead in green technology. In fact, CEFC China Energy thought so much of Hunter Biden's expertise that it paid entities controlled by Mr. Biden and his uncle $4.8 million for 14 months of work. And what did China get for nearly $5 million? The American people deserve to know. Since Mr. Biden is an expert in cobalt mining operations, committee Republicans asked Chairwoman Maloney to invite him here today to shine a light on the importance of cobalt in electric vehicle production. Yet, Hunter Biden is not here today. It's no wonder the Democrats didn't want to invite him, and he didn't want to appear today. Hunter Biden has profited in the short term directly from America's long-term loss, and he doesn't want to explain it to Congress and the American people. We need him to provide answers about the sale of an African cobalt mine that has greatly harmed our access to this critical element, an element we need if we're going to convert to electric vehicles. Oversight Republicans have repeatedly called for answers about Hunter's suspicious foreign business dealings, including the sale of this mine. But we still haven't gotten any answers. The American people deserve answers and accountability. Since Hunter Biden didn't show up today, we're going to hear from the Republican witness, Kenny Stein, who is the policy director at the Institute for Energy Research, and thank you for being here today. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I do want to note that recently you wrote to me saying that you were interested in legitimate oversight instead of playing, quote, political games. But bringing up Hunter Biden is nothing but political theater, plain and simple. And you obviously agreed because you wrote to me yesterday, in less than one business day after your original request to have Mr. Biden, the ranking member's staff contacted me and others on staff and asked for a different minority witness, and that witness is appearing today. So even though Fox News called it, quote, your interview a little tongue-in-cheek with this approach of playing political theater, this is important public policy. We just had a UN scientific report that came out yesterday saying that we are in danger of losing life. We have a chance of combating it by lowering the amount of fossil fuel emissions in our country. Converting to electric cars is one way to do it. 70% of the pollution comes from the fossil fuel emissions, and we have to get off of it in order to save our planet. This is serious challenges for our life, for our environment. We now have a national security challenge. We need to get off of Russian oil. We have to stop consuming so much oil. We have to move to alternatives. and one great alternative is moving to electric vehicles. The private sector is doing that. They're way ahead of us. And the largest fleet in the federal government is the Postal Service. We should be setting an example. We have expert witnesses that can go over the costs, the accessibility, and other challenges that we confront that could help save lives, help our national security, help our dependence on Russian oil, help us get off of it, and to move us forward with a healthier, better environment. I'd say let's stop playing games and political theater, as you so requested, and get back to the importance of this hearing. I now recognize—
Madam Chair, Hunter Biden is an expert on Russian oil as well, but with all due respect, when we talk about converting to electric vehicles, rare earth minerals are a huge component of that, and China has the competitive advantage over us, and we need to talk about rare earth minerals. So
Mr. Comer,
Hunter Biden
you are not
is
recognized.
Obviously a rare earth mineral expert.
Now, if you're concerned about competing with China, we have a bill on that.
Broker the
we'll be
sale of a
passing.
rare earth
You're not recognized.
mine in
I now
Africa
recognize
to China.
Mr.
So
Conley.
it's not political gamesmanship. It's clearly
Thank you, Madam.
Let's get serious. Let's face these problems and solve them. Okay, Mr. Conley's now recognized.
I thank
2
the
minutes.
I thank the chair for holding today's hearing on the U.S. Postal Service's future vehicle fleet. I think that's our topic. Among the first bills I introduced when I came to Congress with the Oversight and Reform Committee was the Postal Service Electric Motor Vehicle Act of May 2010, 12 years ago. Unfortunately, we're only slightly closer to a green postal service fleet today, 12 years later. As co-chair of the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition, I remain committed to partnering with President Biden to realize his long-term goal of running a federal fleet on 100% clean power. This moment is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to take electric vehicle technology, which is hardly new, hardly guinea pig technology, to the next level, with the second largest vehicle fleet in America, and to do so through union labor. My own investigation and oversight work on the green fleet includes letters to Oshkosh House leadership and to Postmaster General DeJoy, demanding investment in union-built electric vehicles. I've requested that the U.S. Postal Service Office of Inspector General investigate whether the Postal Service complied with the National Environmental Policy Act in the generation of the economic impact statement for the purchase of its vehicle fleet. I've repeatedly supported legislation to both fund and require the purchase of an electric vehicle fleet, including in the Build Back Better Act, the Postal Service Improvement Act, and my own bill, the Green Postal Service Fleet Act of 2022, which would require the Postal Service to procure at least 75% EVs in each purchase made against the Oshkosh contract. Mr. DeJoy's investment in a fleet that is only 20% EV is simply not enough. His decisions are antediluvian and anachronistic. And we have reason to believe that the assumptions Mr. DeJoy is using to justify his investments in internal combustion technology fail to factor in fluctuations in gas prices and the lower upkeep and maintenance repair costs for EVs. In short, the Postmaster General appears to have cooked the Postal Service books to justify a multi-billion-dollar investment in outdated technologies that contribute to the environmental degradation of our planet. We cannot and will not go along with that. Let us move the Green Postal Fleet Service Act and find additional ways to foster a robust, electrified postal service vehicle fleet of the 21st century that serves this nation and it serves postal customers. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Lynch, who is the chairman of the National Security Subcommittee, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the sponsor of H.R. 3521, the Postal Service Electric Fleet Authorization Act, I do welcome today's hearing to examine how we can work with the Postal Service to facilitate its transition to a modern electric vehicle fleet. I'd like to thank Chairwoman Maloney for her steadfast focus on this issue, and I'd also like to thank and recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, and Gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Brenda Lawrence, for their continued leadership on postal fleet modernization. According to a recent request that I made to the United States Postal Service, our current postal vehicle inventory consists of about 216,105 delivery vehicles. That's only second to the Defense Department in volume of vehicles. Over 136,000 of those vehicles, about 63% of them, are so-called long-life vehicles that have been on the road for an average of 29 years, which is about 5 years beyond their expected service life. So currently there are no electric delivery vehicles in the existing postal fleet, which is unbelievable, which accounts for about, like I said, 1/3 of the entire federal government fleet. To its credit, now the Postal Service is taking steps to electrify a small percentage of its delivery truck fleet. However, our interest in promoting the environmental sustainability of our federal agencies and reducing carbon pollution in our communities demand that we energize and greatly accelerate the agency's transition to electric vehicles. So we must, as the chairwoman says, we must lead by example. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Ms. Lawrence for 1 minute for an opening statement and thank her and Mr. Lynch and Mr. Conley for their leadership, and Mr. Comer for their leadership on this issue.
I want to thank the chair for holding this important meeting. As a 30-year veteran of the United States Postal Service and a representative of the Motor City, Detroit, the city who put the world on wheels, this hearing is particularly meaningful to me. As the big three automakers led the way in expanding access to electric vehicle, the United States Postal Service, which owns, as we heard, the largest civilian fleet in the federal government, they have an opportunity to champion the leadership of President Biden and our auto industry to push to electrify the federal fleet. Fortunately, the Postal Service is well positioned to not only invest in a robust vehicle fleet, but their existing nationwide footprint provides the perfect opportunity to strengthen our company's growing EV network. I want you to know I am disappointed by the Postal Service initial purchase of the next generation delivery vehicles. I believe, though, that there is still an opportunity for the agency to substantially invest in electric vehicles in subsequent orders. I want to commend my colleagues on this committee for fighting for the inclusion of dedicated funding. There is no excuse to purchase electric vehicles in the Build Back Better Act, and I look forward to looking for additional avenues to make this investment a reality. If the Postal Service is going to invest in new vehicles to be used for the foreseeable future, we must ensure that they are doing so in a way that makes sense both financially and in a way that is a meaningful effort to protect the environment. As we all know, the motto of the Postal Service is rain, sleet, or snow will not stop us from our appointed rounds. Well, we should not let the carbon footprint of the Postal Service be one that will be harmful not only to America but to the world. I want to recognize and thank the witnesses who are testifying today, and I look forward to discussing how the Postal Service can truly lead the way with electric vehicles. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, but before we continue, I ask unanimous consent that Congressman Huffman be allowed to participate in today's hearing without objection, so ordered.
Madam Chair, I also have a unanimous consent request to enter into the record 2 articles from 2, I believe, credible liberal publications, the New York Times and the Washington Post. The New York Times article, How Hunter Biden's Firm Helped Secure Cobalt for the Chinese, and the Washington Post article, The Hunter Biden Story is an Opportunity for Reckoning, into the record.
Without objection.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter sent to Louis DeJoy on the great company that is now operating in South Carolina and goes into detail on the EVs.
Without objection. Now I would like to introduce our witnesses for today. Our first witness is Tammy Whitcomb, who is the IG Inspector General for the Postal Service. Then we will hear from Victoria Stephen, who is the Executive Director of the Next Generation Delivery Vehicle at the Postal Service. Next, we will hear from Kenny Stein, who is the Policy Director at the Institute for Energy Research. Next, we will hear from Jill Nauman, who is the Acting Director of the Physical Infrastructure Team at the Government Accountability Office. Finally, we will hear from Joe Britton, who is the Executive Director of the Zero Emission Transportation Association. The witnesses will be unmuted, so we may swear them in. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. And with that, Ms. Whitcomb, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Good morning, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss our work related to the Postal Service's adoption of electric vehicles. Our mission to ensure the efficiency, accountability, and integrity of our nation's Postal Service is something we take very seriously. Last February, the Postal Service awarded a contract to produce and deploy up to 165,000 new delivery vehicles over the next 10 years. While the contract allows for both electric and gasoline-powered vehicles, the Postal Service's current plan is for most of the new vehicles to be gasoline-powered. We have two recent reports related to this purchasing decision. One of our reports was a research paper that identified the opportunities and challenges for the Postal Service in adopting these electric vehicles. We found electric vehicles are well suited for most postal routes, and there are clear benefits to their adoption. For example, a large fleet of electric vehicles would help the Postal Service decrease its greenhouse gas emissions and encourage the growth of the electric vehicle market in the United States. Additionally, electric vehicles are more mechanically reliable than gas-powered vehicles and require less scheduled maintenance. They would also result in the Postal Service incurring lower and more reliable and stable energy costs. However, there are challenges associated with adopting an electric vehicle fleet. The upfront costs are significantly higher than gasoline-powered vehicles. The Postal Service would need to pay a higher per-vehicle price and incur the cost of installing the charging infrastructure. The Postal Service has over 17,000 delivery units that may host electric vehicles, and the cost and issues associated with installing charging infrastructure will vary by each, depending on the parking layout, power availability, and required upgrades. Good planning, along with early and consistent communication with local governments and utility companies, could help overcome these challenges. We found the Postal Service could save money in the long term by deploying electric vehicles on certain routes, for example, on longer routes and in areas of the country where gas prices are traditionally higher. The Postal Service might also be able to lower the costs associated with electric vehicles by exploring different mixes of the type and number of chargers. Because many delivery routes are short, it is unlikely that every vehicle would need to plug into a charger every night. There are two other factors that could significantly change the cost-benefit analysis of purchasing electric vehicles: federal funding and local incentives. The Postal Service has stated it could achieve full electrification of its delivery fleet if Congress provided $6.9 billion. Incentive programs by local utility companies might also help offset costs. The Postal Service would not be the only logistics organization using electric vehicles. As part of our report, we looked at how other federal agencies, foreign posts, and companies in the logistics and shipping sector have deployed electric vehicles. While their fleets are different in many ways, their experiences may be informative. We found that they used a wide variety of electric vehicles and charging infrastructures, and they emphasized the importance of working closely with local utilities and other stakeholders as early as possible in the planning process. Another report related to the purchase of new delivery vehicles was an audit of the contract clauses. While we found the contract was designed to mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse, it could have been stronger. We recommended additional language to encourage self-reporting by the contractor of potentially inappropriate or illegal activity during the development and production of these vehicles. Management agreed to make these changes. In response to a recently received congressional request, we have initiated an audit focusing on the Postal Service's vehicle acquisition process and its compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act. We will also examine the reliability and reasonableness of the Postal Service's environmental impact statement and its supporting analysis. Another ongoing report focuses on whether the Postal Service's vehicle maintenance facilities are ready for both the electric and gasoline-powered next-generation delivery vehicles. We plan to release both of these reports later this year. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today about this very important topic. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss our work, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens, you're now recognized for your testimony. Can you turn on your mic?
Apologies. Is that better? Got it?
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the committee. Thank you for calling this hearing to examine the benefits, opportunities, and challenges of electrifying the postal fleet. My name is Vicki Stephen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Postal Service's Next Generation Delivery Vehicle Program, which is a key component in our Delivering for America strategic plan. Replacing our aged fleet is a critical part of our organizational transformation, but is by no means the only critical part. We have many competing operational objectives to address in the immediate term. The higher purchase and infrastructure cost of vehicle electrification adds tension to that competition, especially considering it's not mission critical. Nevertheless, we understand the national interest in moving toward an energy efficient and environmentally sensitive future and are committed to doing our part. On March 24th, we placed an order for 50,000 vehicles, of which 10,019 will be battery electric or BEVs, and assigned to the routes that present the best initial application for such vehicles. This action demonstrates our commitment to including BEVs as a significant part of our delivery fleet and was carefully evaluated in the context of our unique delivery mission, our policy mandates, and organizational and financial constraints. Under our universal service obligation, we delivered to 163 million addresses in all climates and landscapes 6 days a week, and we must do so in a financially self-sufficient manner. It is vital that we provide our carriers with appropriate vehicles to support this specific and robust delivery mission. The urgent need to replace our vehicles is not in dispute. Many of our 190,000 delivery vehicles are inefficient, and they lack basic safety features and ergonomic features, including air conditioning, airbags, anti-lock brakes. I must stress that our vehicles cannot be compared to other private delivery or government fleets in nature, use case, or scope. Understandably, there's interest in the vehicle costs, and I look forward to articulating the factors that contribute to cost today, and note that the differential between the two versions is comfortably within the range of commercially available internal combustion, or ICE, and battery electric vehicles. As my written testimony describes in detail, we have very specific vehicle requirements, including right-hand drive and ergonomic features necessary to perform delivery to curbside mailboxes, as well as ruggedized components built to support the wear and tear of our postal delivery operations. The NGDV program is just one part of our mixed delivery fleet strategy. We will continue to purchase the types of vehicles that best align with our routes. Any mix of replacement vehicles will deliver significant reductions in emissions and improvements in fuel economy over our existing long-life vehicles. I would note, however, that we have 12,500 routes over 70 miles in length that are not candidates for electrification today, and another 5,000 that require all-wheel drive vehicles due to extreme climate conditions. Electrification also comes with the challenge of installing infrastructure at a multitude of postal facilities. Our search for replacement vehicles began in January of 2015. After several years of industry outreach, study, evaluation, and prototyping, we conducted a robust and open production competition and awarded Oshkosh Defense a manufacturing contract in February of 2021. The contract provides us with the ongoing ability to purchase between 50 and 165,000 NGDVs that will be equipped with either ICE or BEV powertrains. NGDVs can be purchased in any proportion throughout the contract life. However, our total cost of ownership model points to a substantially ICE fleet due to the higher acquisition and infrastructure costs for the BEVs. Our procurement was deliberative. We considered the characteristics of more than 200,000 carrier routes to assess the appropriate vehicle for each and analyzed fuel and maintenance savings. We found that the benefits are not enough to overcome the higher costs over the 20-year life of the vehicle. We also followed all of the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, including consultations with the EPA and the Council on Environmental Quality, and responding to thousands of public comments. Our ultimate decision was designed with enough flexibility to allow us to increase the proportion of BEVs if financial circumstances change and if the use case continues to improve, as evidenced by our recent purchase order. The recent NGDV purchase contract was the culmination of years of careful needs analysis and procurement discipline, all linked to our unique operational imperatives. The opportunity to electrify at least 10,019 delivery vehicles is a meaningful step in the direction of broader electrification that is a priority for many of our stakeholders. So thank you for the opportunity to address these matters, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stein, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. My name is Kenny Stein, and I'm the Policy Director for the Institute for Energy Research. We're a free market organization that conducts research and analysis on the function, operation, and regulation of energy markets. At the outset, I'll say the Postal Service's correct improvement to take a gradual approach to introducing electric vehicles into its fleet. As both the Service's record of decision as well as the Inspector General's report make clear, EVs are substantially more expensive than the internal combustion alternative, due not just to the higher cost of the vehicle itself, but the large expense needed to install charging facilities for the new vehicles. The same two documents make clear that this cost differential is so great that the expected lower operating costs of EVs over their lifetime does not make up for the higher upfront cost, except in certain locations, certain routes. And even those exceptions are based on certain assumptions, and if those assumptions have proved overly optimistic, EVs could actually end up being a long-term financial drag on the Postal Service. But beyond pure cost considerations, there's a number of questionable assumptions that are underlying this predicted EV transition. The cost of battery modules, which are the most expensive part of an EV, have indeed been falling for many years, but this price decrease cannot and will not continue indefinitely. Once manufacturing is optimized, companies are left with the underlying cost of the mineral inputs of the battery. So nickel, cobalt, lithium, various rare earth minerals have seen prices rise in recent years, and EV prices have had to increase in tandem. While there are research efforts underway to find alternatives for some of these elements, fundamentally you always need a bulky battery to power an EV. Basic physics limits how small an EV battery can get, and the fact that the NGDV will need to have its batteries replaced within 10 years increases the significance of this battery assumption, because it's not guaranteed that replacement batteries will be less expensive than the many thousands of dollars that they cost today. It's also assumed that electricity prices will not increase in the future. This is much of the basis for claiming fuel cost savings over internal combustion engines. But over the last several decades, electricity prices have been flat to increasing in the United States. There's no evidence for the oft-asserted claim that more renewable electricity generation will end up lowering electricity prices. The evidence we have actually more often suggests the opposite, that the higher the share of generation from wind and solar, the higher electricity prices. On top of those existing trends, forced and voluntary transitions to EVs, as well as political pressure to increase electrification, stands to increase demand for electricity in the coming years. The infrastructure to supply this additional demand is subject to delay and limitations due to environmental objections or simple land use opposition. So all these factors, higher demand, cost of their supply, expensive transmission, mean that the expectation for future electricity prices must be higher prices, not lower. The supply chain for electric vehicles also needs to be part of the Postal Service's decision-making process. The supply availability of many of the inputs for EVs is in doubt. Even at the end of last year, nickel supplies were forecast to be short by 128,000 tons in 2021, with a cobalt shortage of 1,800 tons. Supplies were further forecast to be tight all the way through 2025. Russia's invasion of Ukraine puts nickel supplies on an even more uncertain footing, given that Russia produces about 20% of the global supply of nickel. A deficit in lithium is also expected by 2025. These shortages cannot be quickly remedied. It takes many years to bring a new mine into production. With prices of mineral inputs high, there's a high likelihood of EVs being more expensive in the near term. It's even possible that there will simply not be enough minerals to meet the demand for electric vehicles. While a Ford or a GM can wait a few years to hit its EV sales goal, the Postal Service needs the replacement vehicles today. There's a very real prospect of EVs being delayed due to supply shortages. The source of mineral inputs should also be a concern, especially for this committee, given the discussion earlier. While U.S. mines do produce some of the minerals which go into EVs, the raw materials are overwhelmingly processed outside the United States. This is especially true for the components of EV batteries, the supply chain of which is dominated by China. China processes the majority of the world's cobalt, nickel, lithium, manganese, and graphite, as well as many rare earth minerals. China also dominates finished battery production, producing around 80% of the world's lithium-ion batteries. Now, there are currently companies building battery plants in the United States and working on permitting mines, but alternative supplies will take many years to come to market. And again, the Postal Service needs their vehicles now. We can hope that 5 to 10 years from now, more of the supply and processing for EVs will take place in the United States or its close allies, but today, any increase in EV procurement by the Postal Service will be enriching China. The uncertainty around the utility of EVs for the Postal Service, the high cost of EVs, and EV supply chain concerns all point in the same direction for the Postal Service: caution. These factors strongly support the service's decision to slowly introduce EVs into their fleet. These factors may change in the future, but as of today, with the Postal Service having immediate need to replace its aging delivery fleet, EVs are an unnecessary risk to the true mission of the Post Office, which is to deliver the mail, not to support larger micromanaging of the national motor vehicles market. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Naman, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Postal Service's efforts to acquire electric vehicles in its delivery fleet. The Postal Service and the federal government rely largely on gas vehicles to carry out a variety of government missions. In 2020, over 600,000 vehicles in federal fleets, including the postal delivery fleet, traveled over 4 billion miles and used an estimated 360 million gallons of gas and diesel. Transitioning federal fleets to electric vehicles will represent a significant transformation for the federal government. It will also require agencies to conduct sound analysis to support their decision-making. My testimony today will focus on preliminary observations from ongoing work. Specifically, I will discuss tools the Postal Service used to determine the number of gas and electric delivery vehicles to purchase, and factors affecting the federal fleet's transition to electric vehicles. Last month, the Postal Service ordered 50,000 new delivery vehicles, including about 10,000 that will be electric. To inform its decision, USPS conducted a total cost of ownership analysis of a range of types of vehicles. Information in this analysis included the maintenance and fuel costs of each vehicle. It also developed a model that recommends the lowest cost vehicle for each delivery route and a mix of vehicles to purchase each year. The model is based on a set of assumptions, including information from the total cost of ownership analysis and details on individual delivery routes. USPS told us the model was one aspect of their decision-making, and although it recommended purchasing 0 electric vehicles this year, the initial order included 20% electric vehicles. Our preliminary analysis of the model raises questions about the way in which certain assumptions estimate the costs and benefits of the gas and electric vehicles. I'll highlight a few examples. First, the model we reviewed used a 2020 gas price that is almost $2 per gallon less than the current national average. USPS told us they continue to update their model, and we will further evaluate how changing the price per gallon would change the recommended vehicle mix. Second, the model appears to assume maintenance would be more expensive for electric vehicles than gas. This is inconsistent with research we have identified, our interviews with private delivery companies, and Postal Service documents that show electric vehicles are expected to be less expensive to maintain. Third, the total cost of ownership analysis does not include a reduction in emissions as a benefit of electric vehicles. A separate USPS environmental impact statement found that with no tailpipe emissions, electric vehicles would have this benefit. In our ongoing work, we will test assumptions in the model to understand how they affect the recommended vehicle mix. I'll turn now to factors that have so far affected the widespread acquisition of electric vehicles in federal fleets. We have previously reported that these factors include the higher upfront costs of electric vehicles and uncertainties around the cost and installation of charging infrastructure. Our ongoing work indicates that these factors remain relevant. For example, USPS officials said the higher upfront cost was a key factor in their decision-making. They estimate that the new electric and gas delivery vehicles will not cost the same until 2031. In addition, USPS estimates a range in the cost of installing chargers, depending on the site. And it is uncertain whether older facilities have sufficient power capacity to support the charging infrastructure. In closing, some aspects of the transition to electric vehicles may become easier to manage as the market evolves. Other aspects will take some work to address. All aspects of this transition, however, will require agencies to use reasonable and current data and transparent analysis of costs and benefits to support their decisions. We will continue to assess these issues in our ongoing work. This concludes my statement. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Britton, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Chair Maloney and Ranking Member Comer and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today excuse me, about the benefits of electrifying the U.S. Postal Service. My name is Joe Britton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Zero Emission Transportation Association, a coalition spanning the entire EV supply chain, from vehicle to battery manufacturers to charging companies to critical material developers to utilities. We believe firmly in Postal Service electrification with set daily routes, routine idling, and overnight depots that are ideal for charging. We believe these vehicles are the ideal use case in the entire federal fleet. Electrifying this vehicle segment will deliver vast economic, environmental, and public health benefits. Independent studies show that electrifying these vehicles could save the Postal Service $4.3 billion, and that 97% of these vehicles could be transitioned at a lower total cost of ownership. This should be an enormous opportunity for the Postal Service, but somehow this contract has veered off track. The Postal Service initially announced it was going to procure a swappable gas vehicle that could later be made electric. After months of asking for detail about this prototype, USPS acknowledged that a swappable drivetrain was no longer part of their plans. Instead, they are now relying on estimates that do not reflect the market for performance nor pricing in comparing gas to electric vehicles. For example, in deciding whether to go electric or remain reliant on gasoline, USPS, as the chair has noted and GAO has noted, they're relying on $2.19 per gallon gasoline when Americans today are paying twice that amount. Even harder to believe is their assumption that gas prices will be $2.55 in the year 2040. I don't think anybody in the room today believes that gas prices are going to be 50% cheaper 20 years from now. And that's a real problem for the Postal Service because the vehicles that they're proposing to procure only get 8 to 14 miles per gallon, which is lower than the 17 miles per gallon of the 1988 Grumman they're replacing. After years and years, decades of technological innovation, it is indefensible that these vehicles are not more fuel efficient. USPS is also dramatically underestimating the capabilities of electric vehicles. For example, in their benchmark EV, they state that it should have a 94 kilowatt hour battery pack, but that it would only get 70 miles of range per charge. The standard in the marketplace is double that today. We've only seen this poor range to battery pack estimate for extraordinarily heavy vehicles like Class 8 tractor trailers and semi-trucks. It's unbelievable that this vehicle would only get 70 miles of range. The Postal Service is also claiming exorbitantly high charging costs. And the Inspector General here today called attention to their estimate that it would cost $18,000 per charger, which is far more than the current federal blanket purchase agreement already negotiated to install these very same chargers today. And they project that a dedicated charger is needed for every single vehicle. But with accurate route and range estimates, we suggest 2 to 3 vehicles could effectively share the same charger. Ultimately, the Postal Service is relying on information that is creating a skewed comparative cost projection. It doesn't need to be this way. I think Mr. Stein and I would agree that we could maybe look to the marketplace to see what others are doing. They have already recognized the opportunity of electrification and are locking in years of strategic advantages over the Postal Service with their own fleets. This includes bulk EV purchases from UPS and Amazon, 70% electrification goals from DHL, and 100% commitment to electrification from FedEx. These companies estimate 60 to 75% fuel cost savings and 50 to 80% savings on maintenance and service. The Postal Service EIS is opaque and limited, but from the little they have disclosed, it shows their assumptions are not grounded in fact. Unless they reverse course, they will continue to bear these unnecessary costs for both gasoline and service and maintenance, whereas their competitors will not. We urge the Congress to require the Postal Service to rethink this contract and start with a transparent fleet transition plan, like states and other recipients of federal money are required to do today. This would not require the disclosure of proprietary information. Rather, it would allow USPS to produce a market analysis using transparent third-party engineering and modeling to assess the feasibility of electrification. We think the answers will be clear and more closely reflect the decisions being made by others in the free market. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Madam Chair, before we get into questions, if I may ask unanimous consent to enter 2 letters into the record. The first is a letter from me to the National Archives asking for information about the sale of the cobalt mine from the White House while Hunter Biden's father was vice president, and the archivist's response saying he could only provide to the chair of the committee.
Without objection, we will now recognize Congresswoman Kelly. Well, let's just go to Ms. Brown. Okay. Congresswoman Kelly, you are now recognized. Okay. All right. I'll just recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. On March 24th, the Postal Service placed its first port. We'll just continue right now. On March 24th, the Postal Service placed its first purchase order of 50,000 vehicles with Oshkosh. And although the Postal Service initially insisted it could buy only 5,000 electric vehicles in this first order, it doubled that amount to 10,000 after this committee and others began to ask questions. So I'd first like to ask Ms. Stephen, can you briefly explain what changed the Postal Service's analysis to allow for the increase of EVs in this purchase order?
Yes. Am I on? There we go. Thank you for the question. The first thing that is important to note is that the Postal Service has committed to continuing to reassess changes in the market. And so the point that you and some of the other speakers have made today about changing fuel prices, $2.19 was the price at the time that we prepared the analysis. We have continued to do ongoing analysis on changing fuel prices and sensitivity analysis to determine if that changes our mix. It certainly does. The gas prices are higher today than they were when we prepared the initial analysis. So that's one factor. The other key factor is that through the efforts of you and your colleagues, postal reform is making a big difference for the Postal Service. It allows us the flexibility to consider our capital position differently than prior to the passage of postal reform. So between those 2 key variables, we were able to go back and assess our ability to increase the proportion of electric vehicles within our financial resources and within our means, and we're happy to do that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're going to reassess and see if we can move more to electric vehicles, given the testimony we received today, and I'm glad to hear that the Postal Reform Bill is making changes that are helping you reassess. Yes or no, will the Postal Service provide the committee with a copy of the analysis that you used to determine how many electric vehicles to purchase? Yes or no? Will you provide us with that information, please?
If it's specifically requested and protected, yes.
Thank you. Okay, the Postal Service now has roughly $23 billion on hand, including $13 billion that's not allocated to pay down debt. And this committee's bipartisan work will save the Postal Service roughly $50 billion over the next 10 years, and we are proud of that achievement. And we know that EVs are a good investment for the future, for the environment, for our country, for national security. We are asking you to go back and look again and see if we can increase the purchase of the EVs even more. So, Ms. Stephen, given all this, will the Postal Service commit to conducting a new analysis of the EV costs and develop a more aggressive proposal to buy more EVs? We heard several criticisms from many of the panelists today of the analysis and ways that it was possibly not accurate. So could you go back and develop a new analysis for us, given the changing environment, given the changing environmental environment, given the report from the United Nations, given the war in Ukraine, which means we have to get off of oil faster and more effectively? Could you go back and please try a new analysis, given the information we learned today and the changing world economy?
So we've committed to doing ongoing updates as conditions change in the market. So I don't think a new analysis is required. I think the analysis that we've prepared is well designed to look at those variables and assess relative impact. And I think it's also important to note that the $13 billion cash on hand that you referred to is also designated for key fundamental investments that are part of our Delivering for America strategic plan. There have been many things that have gone underinvested over the last many, many years. And so there are other financial priorities that are competing for our resources to make sure that we're addressing all of those needs in addition to the delivery vehicles.
Well, GAO, in their testimony, said they had analyzed the Postal Service's estimates and the cost of buying and maintaining electric vehicles, so I'd like to get their view on it now. So, Ms. Whitcomb, Ms. Nauman, based on GAO's analysis, did the Postal Service make assumptions that you believe are unreasonable and need to be corrected? Could you use the mic?
Our work is still ongoing, and so from our preliminary observations, what we've seen in the documentation the Postal Service has provided us so far, we have some questions. We have questions about how current some of the data is. We have questions about how reasonable some of the estimates are. We have questions about how consistent it is with other information that we've seen in the market and from the Postal Service. And so as we continue our work, we will test these assumptions. We'll gather additional insight from the Postal Service and other sources and assess that against some objective criteria to make our final conclusions.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists. I personally believe that the leadership of the Postal Service relied on faulty assumptions and needs to go back to the drawing board and come up with a much more aggressive plan to electrify the fleet. Otherwise, they risk saddling the Postal Service with an antiquated, gas-guzzling fleet for the next 20 years. I now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer. You are now recognized. Thank you all for your excellent testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Stein, I was somewhat criticized by my very good friend, the chairwoman, for politicizing the importance of cobalt and the need to have a witness talk about how important cobalt is in the production of batteries for electric vehicles. Can you kind of explain the importance of that rare earth mineral cobalt in the production of electric vehicles?
Sure. So cobalt is a crucial element in the battery production process, which among other elements. And the key about cobalt, especially among minerals, is that it's not found in all that many places. It's the largest mines, the largest production is in the Congo, but the majority of the mines in the Congo are actually owned by the Chinese state-owned companies. And about 80% of the cobalt processing happens in China itself. So if we're talking about national security issues, there's been discussion of national security regarding oil, but there's national security issues with the EV supply chain and with renewables more generally, too.
So let me get this straight. 80% of the world cobalt market is now owned by China?
Well, the processing. Well, we need to make a distinction between the mining and the processing.
Right.
The mining happens in Australia,
right.
in Congo, but yes,
okay.
the actual processing.
So, in your opinion, it does harm our national security if China has that much of a market share for the production of cobalt?
100%, because we just recently have gotten to the point where we produce enough energy domestically, natural gas and oil, that we are not truly self-sufficient, but we are largely able to operate independently from the international conditions. But when we're talking about renewables, this goes for solar as well as electric vehicles and batteries, all batteries. The production process happens overwhelmingly in China. So we'll be exchanging one dependence on oil for another dependence on China. And I'm not sure as a national security trade-off that is an improvement.
Well, it seems odd that the son of our commander-in-chief played a leading role in selling a major cobalt mine in the Congo to China. Does the United States have domestic sources for these metals?
There are some potential domestic sources. I believe it's the Twin Peaks mine in Minnesota has the potential for some cobalt production, but that's actually the mine that several permits were just withdrawn by the Biden administration for it. So part of the problem with cobalt is that it's pretty dirty to develop, and so environmentalists in the United States don't like it being done here.
So environmentalists don't like mining for cobalt, but environmentalists want to shift American vehicles from fossil fuels to electric vehicles, and we need that cobalt mine to produce electric vehicles.
Yes, the mining can be done in Congo by child labor, and the processing can be done in China with no environmental standards. So that way you get cheap electric vehicle batteries.
Well, what impact will President Biden's use of the Defense Production Act have on the supply of these metals?
Well, it could have a significant impact, but that would involve using it to encourage domestic mining. And that, so far, has not been what he's tried to use the Domestic Production Act for. Now, he did the Defense Production Act. Now, they have tried to encourage, provide some funding for some domestic processing of some of these rare earth, particularly the ones that are mined in Mountain Pass, which is really the only mine in the United States that produces a lot of these minerals. But that, of course, is a long-term play. They have to build the processing capacity. It doesn't currently exist.
So the U.S. does currently have the ability to process the minerals and metals needed for electric vehicle manufacturing, but under the Biden administration, what's that look like?
So there is a mine, Mountain Pass in California, that produces many of these critical minerals. But right now, they have to be sent overseas to be processed. So the company that owns that mine is actually in the process of trying to build domestic processing capacity, but it does not currently exist. And there's a lot of environmental permitting that has to go into that because, again, this is a fairly dirty, processing mining material is a fairly dirty operation.
Wow. Well, Madam Chair, it looks to me like China has a competitive advantage in the rare earth mineral market, which is essential for the production and manufacturing of electric vehicles. So I think we definitely need to have a rare earth mineral expert testify about how we can change the fact that China controls the market on this. This just gives them a further competitive advantage. And if we're going to do what I think a lot of Democrats want to do in the Green New Deal and shift everything from fossil fuels to electric vehicles, then we have to have an honest conversation about the rare earth mineral market and the importance to that in the manufacturing of the batteries for electric vehicles. So I don't think it's political, and hopefully we can get to that point to where we can have a productive, thorough committee hearing about the rare earth mineral market. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and from the District of Columbia,
Madam
Ms.
Chair.
Norton, you are now
Madam Chair.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I request unanimous consent to have the following articles entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. The first article is from the New York Post, dated November 20th, 2021. Hunter Biden's firm helped China gain control of the electric car mineral report. The second article is from E&E Daily. It's from January 21st, 2022. Hunter Biden and the cobalt mine explained. The third article is from the New Delhi, published November the 30th, 2021, Joe Biden's son helped China get control over vast cobalt mine in Africa report. The fourth article is from the Daily Mail, and it is from November the 21st, 2021, and it's entitled, Hunter Biden's private equity firm helped Chinese conglomerate buy American-owned cobalt mine in $3.8 billion deal. Purchase helped China gain the world's largest deposit. I just have two more. I just have two more, that's all.
Quickly,
And
we've got
very
other
quickly,
things to do.
very quickly. And I have from Fox News that Hunter Biden's firm helped Chinese company purchase rich cobalt mine for $3.8 billion. And the last one is from Fox News, published just a few days ago, April the 2nd, 2022. House Republicans invite Hunter Biden to testify on cobalt mining.
Without objection. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, you are now recognized.
I appreciate this hearing, Madam Chair. Bear with me. I begin by asking what is 1 pound worth? Ms. Namani, yes or no? Do you know what 1 additional pound on a delivery vehicle is worth in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Yes or no?
I don't have those exact numbers. We did see in the Postal Service's environmental impact statement that there was a benefit for the electric vehicles. That was something that was not included in the total cost of ownership analysis, so we don't have the exact figures in how it factored into the Postal Service's decision-making. So that's something we want to understand better, is to what extent and how reduced emissions factored into the decision-making, since it was not in the models.
Thank you. Ms. Whitcomb, yes or no, do you know what 1 additional pound on a delivery vehicle is worth in terms of greenhouse gas emissions?
No, I don't, and that's not something that we included in the paper that I just briefed, so.
All right, how about you, Ms. Stephen? Yes or no, do you know what 1 additional pound on a delivery vehicle is worth in terms of greenhouse gas emission?
Yes, I'm aware that it changes the vehicle classification, and it is aligned with a different level of greenhouse gas emissions, but I don't know the specific value.
Well, all of that is understandable. It may come as a shock that in our own research, we found that 1 pound could cost the planet 40 billion pounds of greenhouse gas emissions. That's because 1 pound may be the difference between a clean postal fleet and decades of deadly pollution. Oshkosh Defense, which has been contracted to design and manufacture the next generation delivery vehicle fleet, wants us to believe that the truck and payload will have a combined weight of 8,501 pounds on the dot. 8,501. At 8,500 pounds, the NGDV is within statutory requirements for light-duty vehicle efficiency standards, which would highly favor an electric fleet. Toss in 1 more pound, and it evades this environmental protection. That's why, based on Postal Service's estimated NGDV emissions, a 1 pound package adds up to 2 billion pounds of carbon emissions each year and about 40 billion pounds over the life of the vehicle. Ms. Stevens, was the Postal Service involved in decision strategy calls, or other communications, either internally or with Oshkosh, that led to the 8,501 pound vehicle proposal?
Not to my knowledge, although I would say that their engineering development effort and the data that they use to develop those values are very precise.
Did the Postal Service question why Oshkosh submitted a proposal that was 1 pound above the range for light-duty vehicle efficiency standards?
I am not aware that we questioned that.
Ms. Stevens, I'm glad that more electric vehicles are being purchased. Clearly, the 8,501 pound models 2,941 pound payload capacity is not core to operation. So would you consider shaving off a pound?
I would want to see the data that's used to support that analysis. I'd prefer to respond when I can see the data.
Well, we'll get you the data, but I have to be honest. It looks like the Postal Service, Oshkosh, or both, deliberately juked the statistics, to keep polluting and keep dependent on all. So, Ms. Whitcomb, I look to getting to the bottom of this with you. And I have to yield back the balance of my time now.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Witnesses, thanks for being here. I think obviously us dealing with the post office trying to electrify, obviously it's a situation we need to deal with in this committee. It's under our purview. But one thing that's already been clear that's come out of this hearing so far is that we are trading the apparent dependence on some portions of foreign oil at this point, and frankly because of reckless energy policy from the administration, to a complete reliance on the Chinese with respect to getting electric batteries for the Postal Service. So we are asking the American people to literally pay billions of dollars for batteries that we are going to get from the Chinese, sources from, under Mr. Stein's testimony, cobalt being mined by kids in Africa. The same cobalt material, which is far more harmful to the environment, far more dirty than our own environmentalists in the United States don't want us to mine. They don't want us to mine it here, but it's okay for kids to mine it in Africa and for us to buy it from the Chinese. Mr. Britton, a question for you. Mr. Stein's testimony talked about, frankly, how dirty it is to mine some of these minerals. What is your group's position on advanced nuclear reactors?
We don't have a position.
Mr. Britton, you're from the Zero Emission Transportation Association, and your organization, a Zero Emission Transportation Association, doesn't have an opinion on modular nuclear reactors, advanced nuclear reactors, microreactors that can actually provide the energy output necessary to provide the electric load that an electrified fleet from the post office would provide, but your organization doesn't have an opinion on this.
Well, we focus mostly on what propels the vehicle itself, and so it's gasoline, hydrogen, battery electric. So that's typically where we focus. But I'd be happy to answer.
Mr. Britton, quick question for you.
Yeah.
If you're going to plug an electric vehicle in, where are you getting the electricity from to charge the battery?
From the grid.
And where does that energy, how is the energy that's on the grid get generated?
Depends on the region, but it's a full blend of whether that's coal, gas, renewables, nuclear.
So let me back up. We're talking about trying to have vehicles be zero emission.
Yep.
It's a worthy goal. It's a nice goal. But the reality is that the energy necessary to charge the vehicles still comes from the fossil fuels that the other side of the aisle would want us to completely get away from under the current energy proposals and projections and vision from the Biden administration. Would you say that's correct?
Well, what I would refer you to, which actually is a pretty interesting comparison, so if you look at the Union of Concerned Scientists map for the entire U.S., they actually map out what is the carbon equivalency for a gas-powered car versus an internal combustion engine vehicle or in an EV. And what they find is that across the country, it's often 100 to 200 miles per gallon equivalency when you look at the carbon content. So point being is that in some regions, you might have a cleaner grid. Other areas of the country, you might have a dirtier grid.
Does that study take into account the dirtiness of getting the rare earth minerals to create the battery that goes into the car itself?
Yeah, it's a full well-to-wheel analysis of scope 1, 2, and 3.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Stephens, quick question for you. If the Postal Service was left to its own ability, would you be going down this line of purchasing electric vehicles to the scale that the majority party wants you to purchase electric vehicles?
We would be purchasing the 20% that we are taking forward in our acquisition today. That's an amount that we can afford. There are benefits, particularly if applied to the routes that have the right conditions where we can actually capitalize on the benefits of an electric vehicle. The more you drive, the more you save.
Okay.
So the longer routes that are between 40 and 70 miles in length, are really a sweet spot, and the OIG's independent TCO analysis found the same impact. Longer routes give us the better opportunity for savings potential.
Quick question, because I'm running out of time. I want to try to focus this in.
Yes.
You are going to get funded. That the Democrats want to fund you to make these purchases. More money above what you're currently funded to run operations, or whatever we backfill from the Treasury to keep you guys afloat. Are you taking advantage of any other federal subsidies in order to make these acquisitions? Does that go into the analysis of being able to buy electric vehicles at the post office?
It will go into the analysis. We haven't initiated that body of work yet. We just got the vehicle contract signed. That will be in the process while we develop infrastructure. So we'll absolutely consider it and have plans in the works to assess available incentives.
All right. Real quick, Mr. Stein, I know we kind of talked about the national security aspects of relying on China for electric batteries. In your opinion, would that put us in a worse position from a national security perspective than we currently are with the oil and gas that we do import from several nations around the world?
Certainly 100% based on today, because most of our oil imports today actually come from countries like Canada and Mexico. So even the oil that we're importing isn't necessarily from hostile nations, and that has only been a recent change in the last 10 years.
Madam Chair, considering the fact that the Chinese literally dominate the electric battery market, it makes no sense at all why the United States government should be giving the Postal Service more billions of dollars to acquire batteries that literally come from the Communist Chinese Party and empowering them to put us at a disadvantage here at home. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I want to thank you for calling this important hearing and for the excellent way in which you're conducting it. Climate change is a civilizational emergency bearing down on us. We're seeing record forest fires throughout the western part of the United States, consuming millions of acres of forest. We're seeing record drought throughout the Midwest, record flooding on the East Coast. Hurricanes of record velocity smashing up against the southern coast and the east coast of the country. We had a warning yesterday from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we are not remotely doing enough. This is an emergency that we are in. We need all hands on deck, and instead we get a bunch of silly propaganda lectures about Hunter Biden. The climate benefits of electrifying the postal fleet are significant. The Postal Service's 216,000 delivery vehicles burn about 200 million gallons of gasoline each year, pumping up the demand for gasoline and the price of gasoline. A gallon of gasoline, which weighs roughly 6.3 pounds, produces 20 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases, which will then linger in the Earth's atmosphere and continue to heat and boil the planet for centuries. Altogether, the Postal Service's gas-guzzling fleet emits billions of pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases every year. Mr. Britton, tell us about what some of the concrete climate benefits are that we will see if the Postal Service does the logical thing now and electrifies its entire fleet.
Well, you bring up a good point, which is that each and every year, and I think it was Atlas Public Policy that estimated that there's 12 megatons of carbon savings that would be reduced every year. And just for comparison, we actually put a fair market price on that as the federal government through the tax credit 45Q, which is made available to coal companies, gas processors, fertilizer plants, steam methane reformers to reduce the emission from those smokestacks. If we allow, just as a comparison, the same level of emissions reduction to be reimbursed through the 45Q tax credit, we would be cutting a $6 billion check to the Postal Service for the emissions reduction of electrification.
Well, Ms. Stevens, is fleet electrification now a goal of the Postal Service?
I would say that the Postal Service is focused on our core mission and on the strategies that we've outlined within our Delivering for America plan. The NGDV is a part of that plan, but it is only one piece of the plan. We have many other competing priorities.
Well, right. We want to get the meal delivered to our people. We want to do it 6 days a week. And we want to, I don't want to have constituents calling me because the meal is being delivered to the wrong place and all of that. But within the category of this judgment, would the Postal Service's preference be to have 100% fleet electrification if the funding were available?
If the funding was made available to us, we would absolutely adjust our plans. Our plans today reflect what we can afford within our own resources.
Great. Well, look, I think we all share that as a common goal then. There may be a handful of people left, unfortunately, who are still denying the reality of climate change. There may be some people who are so much in the thrall of the oil and gas industry that they can't admit that the survival of our species is in peril because of the dramatic consequences of climate change all over the world, with the glaciers vanishing and the ocean levels rising and the polar bears drowning because they're good swimmers, but they're not inexhaustible. We're seeing dramatic evidence of the way that the climate of the Earth is changing. And some people just want to, stick their head under the sand. And it's the wrong way to approach a catastrophe of this proportion. So this is a small step. We don't want to overstate it, but it's a very significant one, and symbolically, it's incredibly important, and it will make a real difference in terms of reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we're pumping into our own ecosystem. So I think at this point, Madam Chair, we've got the vast majority of the people who accept the reality of climate change and the imperative of acting to address it, and those people who want to go back to rhetoric that's now aging 10, 15, 20 years ago. I yield back to you, and thank you for this important hearing.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Chair, pursuant to Clause 2K6 of Rule 11 of the Rules of the House, I move that the Committee on Oversight and Reform issue a subpoena to Hunter Biden as an additional witness for this hearing. Hunter Biden helped sell one of the world's largest cobalt mines to China. Cobalt is a key component in batteries for electric vehicles. It's obvious that Hunter Biden has a valuable expertise which he can share with us today at this hearing on electrifying the federal fleet of postal vehicles. And so, Madam Chair, we should have him here at this hearing, and I urge my motion.
Okay, the gentleman has made a motion to subpoena Hunter Biden. His motion is in order. We have consulted with a parliamentarian, and we will be able to place this motion in abeyance, and we will deal with it before the end of today's hearing. This will be done out of courtesy to the important witnesses that we have before us who are here and have to give adequate notice to all members. We will consult with our members and announce a time to return and dispose of this motion. Now we will move on with the rest of the hearing. We have a serious hearing in front of us. Let's move forward. I now recognize the gentleman, Mr. Biggs, for your testimony.
Oh, thanks. I'm happy to give testimony. But I'll ask questions instead. So, when I live in the West, we mine. Arizona's a mining state. An electric vehicle requires elements that come from mines. In fact, the batteries that they rely on come from the ground. There are so many innovations that have been put in place for mining these critical minerals throughout the world, but particularly in the United States and in the Southwest. And yet, we find that this administration, as well as previous administrations, have continued to put speed sticks down to prevent us from getting the mineral resources that we need to actually build electric vehicles, build batteries, build the crazy wind farms that you have, build the materials necessary for solar. You guys just don't want to mine. You don't want to mine. You don't want to extract from the earth the gifts that are necessary to implement your environmental goals and strategies. Mr. Stein, President Biden announced the use of the Defense Production Act to boost mining of rare earth minerals, which are necessary for electric cars in the U.S. Is that going to do anything to help?
So in the announcement, the information that they gave out didn't really say much about mining. There was a lot of discussion of trying to increase processing in the United States, which of course is important too, but there wasn't much action on the actual getting things out of the ground.
Well, can you discuss some of the issues that will exist with regard to permitting rare earth mines and the timeline for getting those mines up and running should this administration ever decide that, hey, we want to be players in the critical minerals?
Well, yeah, it takes, at a minimum, you're talking 5 to 10 years, and that's assuming the permitting goes well. There's some mines, I think the Twin Peaks mine in Minnesota may have had their first permit for 50 years, I think, just had a few of them withdrawn. So this is a long-term thing. It takes many decades, especially given American environmental standards. So if you actually want to do this, it would require a sustained effort by multiple administrations, forcing through some of these environmental permits, fighting back against some of the NIMBYism and environmental opposition to building these mines. And I know that's a big problem in Arizona.
Yeah, so when we think about it, and critical minerals necessary to build batteries and the vehicles themselves that we're talking about today. I can think of one country that has a substantial amount of critical minerals, and that would be Afghanistan. Can you describe, I don't know if it's in your expertise, to describe some of the critical minerals that are available in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the full inventory, but I know that the USGS did do an estimate of the resources available in the mountains in Afghanistan, and almost all these critical minerals were there and present in large quantities. Of course, the question was how to actually build those mines in the middle of a war zone, but yes.
Right, and when we evacuated from Afghanistan, we turned those over to the Taliban, who is now engaged in contractual relations with China to explore and extract. Where are some other places around the world, and I'm thinking of China and other places around the world that have critical minerals that we would be reliant upon were we to adopt this policy that we're discussing today?
Well, that's the key, is that China processes the majority of all these major minerals that go into EV batteries. Now, not all the resources are in China, but they have gone around the world and they have bought up mines, they have bought off politicians, they work with people like the Taliban, who we won't work with. They are open to all comers as long as these resources get sent to China to be processed.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm extremely alarmed at the anti-union actions that Oshkosh has taken in recent months. Many of my colleagues might not realize this, but Oshkosh, Wisconsin facility has been a union facility for decades. And for the record, Madam Chair, those unionized workers are the ones who actually did the work to produce the products and maintain the high standards of production that made Oshkosh a competitor for this massive contract in the first place. When Oshkosh submitted production proposals to USPS, those proposals were based on capabilities demonstrated by the union workers in Wisconsin, who represent countless combined years of experience and expertise in their field. So Oshkosh's sudden decision to manufacture these trucks in an unproven, newly acquired facility with new hires is nothing more than a bait and switch that betrays the very workers who made Oshkosh the company it is today and have proved that they have the skills to get the job done and get it done right. So, Madam Chair, I urge Oshkosh to end these blatant anti-union actions and produce these vehicles in their tested and proven Wisconsin facility. And secondly, and this is something, Ms. Stevens, I hope you do take back to leadership, we do need to talk about the environmental short-sightedness of Postal Service's current plan. In February, in a letter in February that we posted to the Postmaster General DeJoy, Council on Environmental Quality Chair Brenda Mallory, who has come to my district a number of times, she had warned that if the Postal Service fails to improve its environmental review to meet its legal obligations under Nepa, the National Environmental Policy Act, then, quote, Congress or the federal courts may compel USPS to alter course. Like Ms. Mallory, the EPA, and so many of my colleagues, I seriously doubt the Postal Service Environmental Impact Statement meets its obligation as an independent agency. Ms. Stevens, is it fair to say the Postal Service followed its policies under NEPA and would, quote, emphasize environmental issues and alternatives in the consideration of proposed actions, which is direct quote from USPS's own policy on NEPA implementation?
So I would say that our team followed with rigor the NEPA process. We put tens of thousands of person hours.
So yes?
Yes, we've followed the
Okay.
rigors.
So if USPS actually lived up to its responsibilities under NEPA, though, the Postal Service would revise its EIS, and let me explain. Getting it right means saving billions in maintenance and fuel costs and slashing toxic pollution that is choking our communities. I have one of the most polluted zip codes in the state of Michigan, so this is extremely important to my residents. USPS has repeatedly acknowledged that electric vehicles are potentially a better option in its responses to the Inspector General and the EPA, so all we're asking is Postmaster DeJoy and USPS leadership to do is to stop intentionally making bad choices. And let me explain, Ms. Stevens. Right now, what is the maximum number of electric vehicles and the minimum number of gas vehicles the Postal Service can order and meet its contractual obligations right now?
50,000, which is the size of the order that we placed.
But there's room to buy more vehicles, electric vehicles, way more, correct?
Correct, but those would have to be justified and funded.
I urge the Postal Service to revise its EIS to bring itself back into line with the law and administrative policy. And what it is this is a rare opportunity, because right now you could be doing more. And one of the things is the future of, I think, of our climate crisis and so forth. But this is an opportunity. I think you guys are shortfalling, really not doing the maximum you could be doing in that regard. One of the things that I continue to hear from workers and folks on the ground is that we didn't do our due diligence as a federal government with the EIS. And what they're saying is that we didn't go farther, as Ms. Mallory, again, working for the Biden administration, this is a person, again, that has been on the ground talking to people, that looks like you all might end up in court to compel you to comply with the NEPA standards. Are you all aware of that?
What I'm aware of is that we've put a lot of rigors into this, and we built our alternatives to allow us the flexibility to go from a minimum up to 100% battery electric vehicles. We're balancing our financial resources along with the intent to meet these environmental challenges. So it's a balance
So
for
do you think the Council on Environmental Quality Chair Mallory is incorrect here?
I do.
Okay. So you're probably going to end up in court. You were aware of that?
I'm aware what's covered in the media. I'm also aware of...
No, this is factual. I don't really direct the media. I've been involved with the EIS processes as an attorney, and if you're segmenting, if you're cutting up, if you're doing it in a way, and your interpretation of rigor, at the end, if the result is not protecting the public, then you're going to end up in court, ma'am. Thank you so much. I yield.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think it's interesting that we have politicians who are saying that union workers, I guess, are more qualified than those that choose not to be in the union. I would remind my friends across the aisle that it's the employees that have the choice of going union or non-union in a right-to-work state, which is South Carolina is a right-to-work state and is where Oshkosh located their new facilities so they can be competitive, and the employees do not have to go there if that's not what they want. But politicians, for them to be dictating who the Postal Service can buy their vehicles from is laughable, to be honest with you. Ms. Stevens, let me run some figures by you. We've got my good friends across the aisle wanting to rely on China for a product that you have to produce. You realize battery-grade cobalt prices are up 119% from January 1, 2020 through mid-January 2022. Nickel sulfate is gained 55%, and lithium carbonate rose 569%. Who pays the price on these increases, regardless of what the initial cost of the vehicle is? Who bears that, and is that in the budget that you know of?
So our contract that we've signed stipulates a specific price that we will pay for each vehicle. If there are conditions in the market that are well beyond the negotiated pricing, there is a procedural process through our supply management processes to reassess and renegotiate.
But so, you agree that with these increases in prices, that China that has sweatshop labor, with China that is not our friend, with China that is a communist country, this could be a problem, and what's to prevent them from going up 600%? Anything?
You know, the market is a challenge right now. The availability of these resources is a challenge in many ways.
They're a challenge because of the policies of this administration to basically sell out to China. Now, you ask about some of the specifics of the product. What kind of, when they gave you when they gave Oshkosh the mandate to produce a product, they didn't just say, let's just go produce a product. They had specifications, didn't they?
Absolutely.
All right, would you walk me through the requirements that you went through, and the dollars that you put to put prices on a product that was competitively bid, and they were the lower, which I would think my Democrat comrades would like, less cost. Walk me through that process that you went through.
Yeah, thank you. We initiated the process to prepare for this solicitation in 2015. We've been developing prototypes, working with industry, working with producers in this field for many, many years, and conducted an open, competitive production solicitation to arrive at our decisions. I can tell you that Oshkosh Defense compellingly won this competition. They had the highest technical scores. Our employees who drove those vehicles rated them far and away more favorably than any of the other models that were in consideration. And so their pricing was best. This was a compelling example of a clear contract winner when this contract award was made to Oshkosh.
So for 7 years, you invested your time, your tithe, your talent to look at a pricing a vehicle that would be competitive. You didn't know who was going to bid on this, did you?
That's correct.
It was open to any and all comers.
Yes, and we encouraged participation.
Yeah, well, it is an insult for some of the questions you've had to endure, and particularly the insult about labor employees versus non-labor employees. And I admire you for doing this. And has your company has Oshkosh ever made a statement against the union?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
So if employees want to band together, and if they think a union is worth the dues that they pay, that comes out of their paycheck, they've got the freedom to do it in a right-to-work state such as South Carolina.
Yes, that's correct.
Well, thank you for your time. About out of time, so I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Bush, is recognized for her 5 minutes.
St. Louis, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this timely hearing. Electrifying the Postal Service fleet is an urgent priority for environmental justice communities, including those in St. Louis. We have a unique opportunity to reduce tailpipe emissions and decrease cumulative pollution burdens that disproportionately harm Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. The Postal Service's current procurement plan to continue buying gasoline vehicles is in direct conflict with the agency's policy to, quote, emphasize environmental issues and alternatives and protect, restore, and enhance the quality of the human environment, end quote. It is also not in line with the policy to, quote, use the Nepa process to assess reasonable environmental alternatives to propose actions in order to avoid or minimize adverse effects, end quote. I am extremely troubled by the next generation delivery vehicle proposed plan, which doubles down on decades of pollution. Ms. Stevens, is it correct that the Postal Service refused to explore specific environmental justice mitigation options in an expanded environmental impact statement?
I would say that the environmental impact statement supplement that was requested was not justified. Part of that process demands the introduction of new information that was not considered as part of the formal draft or final environmental impact assessment process. There were no substantive issues brought forward through that process that had not previously been addressed, considered, introduced, or addressed in the Postal Service's final environmental impact statement. It just didn't rise to the level that is required to consider a supplemental EIS.
Okay, so the fact that I was quoting the Postal Service's response to the EPA comments in the NGDV final environmental impact statement. Okay, the environmental racism on display from Postal Service leadership, it is absolutely alarming. We have heard of no interest in outside experiences and expertise that do not support management's preference. In fact, Postal Service Management did not genuinely consider alternatives to the proposed plan. It dismissed 100%, it dismissed 75%, and it dismissed even 25% battery electric vehicle options. As a Black woman with asthma from a community littered with brownfields, I am offended. As a Congresswoman representing a district where Black children have made 10 times more emergency room visits for asthma than white children, I am outraged. The Postal Service has a long history of improving the lives of everyone by providing critical public services. The rejection of community-informed priorities by Postal Service Management is out of line with that history. Ms. Nauman, is there anything preventing the Postal Service from incorporating environmental justice into its environmental impact statement?
That's not really in the scope of what we're looking at. We're focused on the optimal mix model and the total cost of ownership model, and the environmental impact statement is a separate process that's outside of the scope of our current work.
So left unchecked and without proactive measures to serve environmental justice communities, the Postal Service's sleight of hand will produce tens of millions of metric tons of emissions over the NGDV's lifespan. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairwoman and our panelists for appearing today. This is certainly a topic that needs to be discussed, the electrification of the postal fleet. We have a constitutional obligation to support the Postal Service. And of course, as part of the American narrative, you know, where do electric vehicles fit? And I would hope that this body has a reasonable and prudent approach to this topic. But I find, troubling though it be, is quite easily observed that my colleagues across the aisle are pushing electric vehicles no matter what. If it's smart, they want electric vehicles. If it's not smart, they want electric vehicles. They're not receptive to reasonable arguments regarding just how effective and efficient it could be. But no one can argue the simple fact that we are responsible for the people's treasure. And American citizens are watching hearings like this, wondering just what is going on in Congress. We had 2.5 million illegal crossings at our southern border last year, 500,000 dedicated criminals. I'm not talking about family units that turn themselves in. I'm talking about what they call gotaways at the border. These young men are plugged into the criminal networks. They're coming here to do no good in our country. We had 80,000 last month pouring across our border. America's watching and saying, what is going on in the Oversight Committee? They're talking about electrification of cars. So let's talk about it. Rescue vehicles on the highways, you've been paying attention, they're all powered by gasoline. Mr. Stein, is that generally true? Highway service vehicles, are they electric?
As far as I know.
No, they're not. Of course, they're on gasoline. Every American has had some experience of running out of fuel. The best of us are most prepared. You get stuck in traffic you didn't expect. There was a crash, something delays your trip, and you're burning fuel you didn't anticipate. You thought you had filled it up a couple of days before, but you did not. For one reason or another, we've all run out of fuel. What do? You get a ride to the nearest service station. You buy a fuel can if you don't already have one. You get back to your vehicle and put fuel in it. What are you going to do with an electric car? Mr. Stein, what are you going to do with an electric car if you run out of juice on the highway?
You have to get it towed.
You have to get it towed. Americans are saying, hold on. We have to have our mail delivered. Madam, what would a Postal Service do right now if a Postal Service vehicle runs out of fuel on its route?
A conventional vehicle today?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, we would call our local team and they.
Yeah, you'd bring a gas pretty quick, wouldn't you?
That's right.
What are you going to do if an electric Postal Service vehicle runs out of juice?
It's more challenging.
You're going to have to tow it.
Yep.
So listen, I say to my colleagues across the aisle, maybe the time has come for this discussion, but let's have it honestly. It's not going to work. We're spending billions of dollars of the people's treasure to accomplish some dream, not to mention what my colleague has brought up. The raw materials for these batteries are being mined by child slave labor overseas. That raw product bought by China is assembled the finished product by slave labor in China. Do we support that? For God's sakes, let's take a step back. As a committee, we owe it to the American people that we serve. Take a hard look at this thing. These patriotic, intelligent young men and women have come before us today. They're prepared to give us answers. The American people deserve the simple task that we accomplish as their congressional servants, that we ask the right questions. The answers are before us. We're asking the wrong questions. We have to reassess the realities of the electrification of the postal fleet. And perhaps my colleagues can accept that simple fact. Madam Chair, I yield.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I have a request that I made to the United States Postal Service just to give me a summary of their vehicle fleet. And I know we have a slide on that. Yeah, there we go. So we do have a dilemma where there are a lot of very, very old vehicles that we have in service that are high-maintenance vehicles, and on this chart, we're talking about LLVs. Those are long-life vehicles. As I mentioned in my opening statement, these are vehicles that have been on the road for about 29 years, 4 or 5 years beyond their expected service life. And so what I might suggest to the Postmaster General is there some way that for those vehicles that are on their last legs, literally, that are presenting a safety or a public safety hazard, really, to not only to the men and women who drive them, but also to the general public. Is there a way we could phase out those vehicles, replace them in the short term with combustion engines vehicles, as regrettable as that is, but to there and after? So in the very immediate term, to take a certain percentage of those vehicles and allow them to be replaced with combustion engines, but for the great majority, I would say 80% of these vehicles that could be replaced gradually, I'd like to see that, as a compromise, invested in and acted upon by the United States Postal Service. Ms. Stephen, is that something that we can work out here? Because the way this is going right now, to have such a small number of electric vehicles, 10% of the fleet, and to commit the American people for the next 30 years to be burning diesel and gas guzzling, vehicles. I have a high asthma rate in a lot of parts of my district. I got a major postal facility, the general postal facility at South Station. And then if you count up all those individual post offices where they are hubs of transportation in the local neighborhoods, it would be a huge benefit to a lot of these people all over the country, Louisiana to Massachusetts, if we could get clean on our postal fleet and convert, completely to electric vehicles. I just want your thoughts on that.
Well, I would say that the internal combustion engine versions of the NGDV have significant improvements in fuel economies and in environmental data versus our existing fleet. So any level of investment.
How do they compare to electric vehicles?
Of course, electric vehicles are better. Of
Yeah.
course, they're better.
I mean, a world better, right? I mean, you know, we're talking zero emissions, right?
200%
So,
was the
so
value. Yeah.
what I'm suggesting is you're starting from, you're clearing a very low bar here. You know, a vehicle that's burning diesel and has been on the road for 29 years, it's pretty easy to beat that.
Certainly.
Is what I'm suggesting.
Yes, emission standards have certainly moved on.
So what about the mix that the way that we're phasing this in? What's the critical path to get us to all electric? What's the most efficient way? And I don't want to wait 30 years for this for this to happen. I'd like it to happen tomorrow if we could.
Sure. So the 10,000 vehicles of that 50,000 purchase that are battery electric vehicles, that's what the Postal Service can fund within our own resources, right? We have structured our contracts, and beyond the contract itself, we've structured the mechanism to allow us to apply additional funding. We can even change the proportion of electric vehicles for the ones that are already on order if additional resources are made available. We're similarly structuring flexibility in our planned contracts for the infrastructure work. So the Postal Service stands ready to make these changes as resources are made available, either from our coffers, which we've already demonstrated, or from other external sources. So we're ready to make those shifts as resources are available.
Thank you. I know I'm running out of time here, but we put $8 billion in the Build Back Better Act. I think $6 billion was for vehicles and $2 billion was for infrastructure. And we've got to move it along here. We're lagging desperately behind where we should be in making this move. Thank you, Madam Chair, for all your courtesy and for your work on this issue as well. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Harrell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Stevens, it was stated earlier that the Postal Service is well-positioned then to electrify their fleet. But is that exactly true, the entire fleet?
Our focus has been on the replacement of the delivery fleet, not our entire fleet.
So the top priority of the Postal Service is still to deliver the mail in a timely fashion?
Absolutely, that's mission critical for us.
And I just want to kind of go off what was just being said. If you were to raise the number of electric vehicles in your current order, where would you find the money? I mean, because you're saying there's maybe some different silos and so forth. Where would that money come from in terms of your budget?
So those adjustments have already been made. That was part of what allowed us to support the decision to go from 5,000 electric vehicles to over 10,000. We were able to look at our own resources. We've had some great progress already, early progress, from the execution of our Delivering for America plan that's helping us find other resources. And of course, postal reform has allowed us to make some shifts in resources. That 10,019 BEVs is the maximum that our resources allow us to support today in light of all of the other organizational priorities that are part of that strategic plan.
Okay, so if you were mandated to, say, increase the number of electric vehicles, it would not have an impact on the Delivering for America plan?
It could potentially. It certainly presents a risk, right? The competing resources, we want to make sure that we're making good on all of the commitments in Delivering for America, so we need to be mindful of those changes. It certainly introduces a risk, but it's not something that we believe is insurmountable. We just need to coordinate those initiatives and make sure that we have the facilitated coordination between them.
Right, because what I think I'm seeing is, we've got two different things happening, because this is going right at the heart of the Postal Service Reform Act that we just passed, and now we're looking at something that's actually going to compromise what we tried to help the post office do. So it makes no sense, but what I'm concerned about is, what about the rising costs in terms of future years? How are you going to subsidize yourselves to continue an increase in cost for an electric vehicle fleet? Because the demand is, in terms of energy and rare earth minerals, et cetera, is not going to go away. So how do you compensate for that?
I would say that we're comfortable with the 10,019 that are in our acquisition today. Unless we have other resources, we would not advance beyond that unless we either find resources or they're made available to us We feel that the 10,019 is a manageable proposition within the scope of all of the other activities that we have underway to support the Delivering for America plan.
So, and I understand it. I mean, I get the energy, I get the environment, I understand all that, but do you think it is worth child-safe labor to have these cars put into your fleet? Yes or no?
No.
And there you have it. And I have to agree with my colleague, Mr. Higgins. We should have a very honest, transparent conversation for the American people about what this means. We have resources here at home, but an administration that refuses to allow us to tap these natural resources, and yet we turn the blind eye on child slave labor around the world and somehow make it okay to invest in a fleet of electric vehicles for the post office or whatever else the administration wants to do. Thank you for your honest answer in that question. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Brown, is now recognized for questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, for holding this hearing, and thank you for all the witnesses for joining us today. First, I would like to thank Congressman Connolly for introducing the Green Postal Service Fleet Act. I'm a proud original co-sponsor of this legislation that would prevent the new purchase of gas-guzzling vehicle fleets for the Postal Service. President Biden has made a clear and stated goal of electrifying the federal fleet, and I fully support his commitment. Let's shift our attention to current events. Russia's recent unprovoked and devastating war against Ukraine underscores the urgency of eliminating our reliance on fossil fuels so that no country is forced to bear higher energy costs due to the behavior of an irrational, unpredictable, and brutal war criminal. Some propose increasing the production of fossil fuels here in the U.S., but that is a very siloed approach that attempts to address one global challenge at the expense of another. Electric vehicle offers an opportunity to address multiple challenges at once. Not only do they reduce emissions to combat climate change, but they also secure America's energy independence while providing the opportunity to create jobs and advance America's competitive edge on the global stage. Mr. Brenton, how are President Biden's Made in America policies ensuring that electric vehicles create a win-win scenario for the American people?
Well, thank you for the question. There's actually a brand new automotive industry corridor that's manufacturing and recreating communities all across, not just from Michigan and Ohio, but down to Indiana, to Kentucky, to Tennessee, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama. We're seeing every single week a new announcement of more jobs and more investments in this space. And it's imperative for us to lean into this because we don't need to look too far back to see what happened when we got caught from behind. If you look in 2007, Americans, because of a gas price spike like we're seeing today, started to turn to more fuel-efficient foreign imports for their vehicles. So this is an opportunity for us to meet consumer demand, create great and good-paying jobs, revitalize communities. If you look at Rivian, they took over a Mitsubishi plant. Tesla has rejuvenated the plant. You look at Lordstown, they took over a GM plant. These are opportunities for us to not only look at the American consumer and the driver, but create jobs and drive down emissions, which are obviously important for both climate change and public health.
Thank you so much. You actually touched on my second question, which was about the jobs being created across the country due to the president's commitment to expanding domestic industrial base for the EV supply chain. So thank you for that. From charging infrastructure to the electric vehicles themselves and the many components they require, the down payments we make now on securing the American vehicle supply chain will provide compounding benefits for the U.S. economy far into the future. Ms. Stephen, will postal routes change because of the adoption of electric vehicles? And also, will it save time on mail delivery?
So I would say that the choice of the vehicle, sorry, I lost where you were on the screen there. The choice of the vehicle, I hate to say it in this way, doesn't matter in terms of the efficiency, except for having a right-hand drive vehicle that's purpose-built for curbside delivery. That is essential to our mission. The decision about whether it's an internal combustion engine or an electric vehicle doesn't affect the daily activities for the carriers who are using those vehicles, as long as it's the right vehicle, that custom-built, right-hand drive vehicle that's built for curbside mail delivery. The source of the energy does not necessarily, we don't anticipate, make a significant difference in how they would go about conducting their work or develop any additional efficiencies.
Thank you for that. So what changes will the Postal Service need to make to ensure the next generation delivery vehicle is part of the solution in securing a win-win electric vehicle future for the American people, Ms. Stevens?
Well, we stand ready to support this effort today. We're excited to bring forward a green platform. Even though we understand the desire to go further, we're really proud to take forward a portion of the fleet that we can afford within our resources, within our strategic plans, and be part of building that future. We've done everything we possibly can to create additional flexibilities that allow us to adjust to go further if additional resources are made available.
Thank you so much. I think we all can agree that more can always be done, and the Postal Service is no exception. But it is time that the Postal Service go all in on electric vehicles, and I look forward to reviewing your plans to do so. And with that, I yield back.
The lady yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, is recognized.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. I know a lot of times in these hearings, a lot of people don't come over here, and I really appreciate all you five folks coming over here. As I understand it, we've shifted, correct, Ms. Stevens, from shifting away from electric vehicles and more towards, shift away from gas-powered vehicles and more towards electric vehicles. You think we'll be able to no problem, we'll be able to produce that many?
I have the utmost confidence in our partner, Oshkosh, to be able to produce whichever quantities of whichever drivetrain we require.
Okay. Some of my colleagues proposed requiring 75% of the vehicles to be electric. Do you think that's a reasonable possibility? Do you think that's really something that could not be handled right now?
I think it's a bit beyond what our estimates say is possible. When we were asked by some of the congressional committee members and staff throughout the last year to assess how far we could go with our electrification, the response we provided was 70% of our delivery fleet acquisitions over the course of the decade could be electrified if resources were made available.
Okay. Ms. Whitcomb, could you give me your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something to consider. Feasibility studies are critical. Some parts of some of the routes are probably not well suited. They might be too long for an electric vehicle. So there are some limitations, but in our study, we found that there's definitely opportunities for significantly more electrification of the vehicle fleet.
Okay, I always care a great deal about the people who put these vehicles together. I'm going to ask Mr. Stein a question, do you mind? And it's kind of a follow-up on what Ms. Harrell said. When we look not just at the companies who's building the vehicles, but the components or the materials that are mined or put together in other countries, could you comment on the difference between the type of people who are working to put together the stuff for the gas-powered vehicles and the electric vehicles?
Well, sure. That gets into the question of where the minerals that go into these vehicles. And when we talk about critical minerals, and we talk about things like cobalt, or we talk about some of the rare earths that are processed in China, these resources right now, they come from places where in the Congo there's child labor, and in China there's an entire race of people that are being enslaved for this sort of thing, the Uyghur minority. So when these supply chains stretch across the world, which they certainly do, and they do to a certain extent in ICE vehicles, they also do as well, but much more of that manufacturing capacity happens in the United States than the...
What was the last country you mentioned there? I missed it.
China. We're talking about the Uyghur, the Muslim minority.
I thought you mentioned another country too, but okay. I know there are people who, they've always been out there and out of sight, out of mind, and they don't care how people are being abused. But is that something that, as far as you know, the United States in any area cares about, or do we just buy from companies, whether it's, the full socialist healthcare, good pensions in France or Germany, or whether it's the Uyghurs and maybe very young people abroad. Is that something that you find here in America? We really don't care who's producing it, or do any companies care about that?
Generally, most companies voluntarily make a big effort to ensure that they're sustainably sourced, I guess, like safely sourced. And the government also requires some of those things too. There's occasional laws that, like the Uyghur minority, there's been laws passed about using Uyghur slave labor. And of course, that's a direct contrast to the way China operates, is they truly do not care. They don't care who dies to get the product as long as it gets to China. And this is a big problem with buying many of our components that are processed in China. It is very hard to trace the supply chain back to where it actually comes from, to know whether there is slave labor used, to know what the conditions are at mines in the Congo that are in the middle of war zones. So you can't send health inspectors in to see what's going on.
For those of us who care about workers in other countries as well as just this country, then, do you feel gas-powered vehicles would, probably the labor that's building them or putting together the components would be a little more what we'd expect in America?
Probably yes, just because so much more of that manufacturing and assembly happens in the United States. So we actually can supervise it. Certainly, some of the resources that go into even ICE cars do come from perhaps unsafe areas and areas where workers are abused. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Chair.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the Postal Service has a once-in-a-generation chance to replace its aging Grumman mail trucks, which last came off the assembly line in 1994. But instead of looking to the future, the Postal Service plans for 90% of its new fleet to be gas guzzlers. These trucks, as we have talked about this morning, get only 14 miles per gallon and less than 9 miles per gallon when the AC runs. And this stands in sharp contrast to the private sector, where major shipping companies are making great efforts to reduce their carbon footprint. For instance, FedEx and Amazon pledged to have their whole operations be carbon neutral by 2040, and electric fleets are a big part of that. UPS also made robust investments in sustainable vehicles to become carbon neutral by 2050. Mr. Britton, can you briefly give your experience working with the private sector and give us a sense of whether FedEx and Amazon can meet these bold pledges?
Well, actually, just last week, I was at the Rivian plant and saw the Amazon vehicles firsthand. They've ordered 100,000 of them. They're in production. And I think that Amazon is going to be quite happy with the fuel savings. We actually created a report and analysis of how much it costs to propel your vehicle with gasoline versus electricity, and we did a comparison in 16 different states. You could compare AAA gas price data to Energy Information Administration electricity data, and we found that it's 500 to 600 times more costly to power your vehicle with gasoline. And so I think both Amazon and FedEx will be quite happy with their 100% electrification plans.
Yeah, I bet they would. Ms. Stephen, as your direct competitors electrify their fleets, and we have cities and counties all over America that are electrifying their buses, it blows my mind that the U.S. Postal Service is taking such, infinitesimal steps towards electrification. As your direct competitors electrify their fleets, how can you justify transitioning just 10% of USPS's fleet to electric vehicles?
So first, I'd like to clarify that the 10,019 vehicles out of our 50,000 purchase, it's higher than the 10% statistic. But the most important point, why there is a difference, our use case is different. It's completely different. The Postal Service drive cycle, as we refer to it, includes hundreds of starts and stops throughout the day. Our carriers are driving house to house, mailbox to mailbox. There's a start, an acceleration, a stop, then the delivery of mail into the mailbox, and then they start over again. And they do that hundreds of times a day. Typically, our competitors, when they drive down a similar street, will stop.
Okay, I'm just going to reclaim my time there because I'm sorry. I'm going to reclaim my time because your answer is warranting my asking Ms. Whitcomb, because the USPS OIG noted in its own audit that frequent stopping may allow delivery vehicles to increase efficiency through regenerative braking, which is a standard feature in electric vehicles. So Ms. Whitcomb, what impact would the frequent stops have on the overall life of an electric vehicle battery and consequently the total cost of ownership?
Yeah, in some cases, we thought it provided some opportunities, and so I'm probably maybe a little less qualified than Mr. Britton to address the regenerative braking issue, but we did address that as part in our work, that there are some opportunities there in the use case the Postal Service provides to enhance its use of electric vehicles.
Well, Mr. Britton, do you want to answer that question and then answer under the same driving conditions, would an electric vehicle perform better or worse than a gas-powered vehicle?
Well, it would perform better, and actually it's in some ways the inverse of what you would expect with an internal combustion engine vehicle. In an ICE vehicle, you may get better gas mileage on the highway. For many EVs, the starting and stopping, especially if you have strong regenerative braking, will provide you greater range in city driving, especially with use cases where you're starting and stopping every 20 or 30 feet. That's especially important from an emission standpoint, though. Your average internal combustion engine postal vehicle is idling that entire time and emitting not only CO2, but other pollution into the community that we do not need to do. And so the frequent start and stop makes it a perfect use case for electrification.
And lastly, Ms. Whitcomb, assuming that the adoption of electric vehicles will save the Postal Service money in the long run, does USPS have the financial resources to increase its percentage of electric vehicles?
The Postal Service has a significant amount of cash set aside for capital investments. Obviously, some of that money is going towards its vehicle fleet along with other capital investments. And so I think in our analysis, our model showed that there are some benefits to subsidies to help the Postal Service. It makes the cost-benefit equation better for the Postal Service, but obviously the Postal Service is investing its own cash right now in the electric vehicles.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. And now the gentleman from Georgia. Mr. Johnson is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There are vehicles in the Postal Service fleet that are 30 years old. When would be a good time to transition to a less fuel-dependent fleet, if not now? Electric vehicles will release less emissions, reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, and help lead our country in the right direction in combating the climate crisis. And electric vehicles will also save taxpayers $100 million in costs for gasoline. Ms. Stephen, based on an average price for gasoline as of January 2021, it would cost $500 million to fuel the Postal Service's internal combustion engine fleet to cover 1.5 billion vehicle miles traveled annually at $3 a gallon, which was the average price in January 2021. Isn't that correct?
I will assume that your data is correct.
And using the June 2021 average price for electricity, an electric fleet could cover the same number of miles for hundreds of million dollars less. Isn't that correct?
I don't know that it's correct. Part of what the difference is how far you drive. And
Well, just based on current figures,
sure.
Wouldn't the taxpayer save hundreds of millions of dollars per year in gasoline cost if we were to move to an electric vehicle fleet?
The Postal Service funds those fuel costs, not the taxpayers, and so there would be potential savings.
Okay, you're right.
Right,
but the people who purchase stamps who pay for the Postal Service,
correct. Yes, sir.
They would suffer a cost. Well, let's just say the Postal Service can do business with an electric fleet operating without having to purchase hundreds of $millions in gasoline per year. That would save the customers of the post office, correct?
Agreed.
And the investment in an electric vehicle fleet would not only insulate the Postal Service from high and variable gasoline prices, but it would also diminish the cost of potential increased miles traveled that were not budgeted. Isn't that correct?
I would agree with your point.
And in 2016, the Postal Service fleet traveled 203 million more miles than originally estimated, correct?
I believe that's correct.
And that required a purchase of 30 million more gallons of gasoline than initially projected, correct?
I believe so.
And thank you. Ms. Namain, rural communities are sometimes overlooked, and I'm worried that they may not be able to benefit from the technological advances of electric vehicles. Have you looked at the infrastructural demands for rural and low-income communities and options for meeting that demand?
We haven't looked at that specifically. We do note that installation of charging infrastructure is a significant factor that needs to be considered and can be a challenge in determining the placement of the correct deployment of the vehicles and providing the service that's expected.
Thank you. Ms. Whitcomb, according to the U.S. Postal Service OIG report, a report published in 2021 showed that 6 electric vehicles acquired in 2017 had reduced fuel consumption by 5,888 gallons and saved approximately $10,000 in fuel cost. Just 6 vehicles. Imagine if the entire fleet were to be replaced. What would cost savings and fuel consumption look like if every postal vehicle were electric?
Yeah, when we did our analysis of what would happen if the charging infrastructure and the initial purchase of the vehicles was subsidized, we found that it would be an 11% decrease in cost for the Postal Service moving forward with an electric fleet. So it has a significant impact on the Postal Service's cost moving forward because of the fuel cost reduction, energy cost reduction, as well as the charging infrastructure and maintenance reductions as well. So there's definitely a positive impact moving forward. The challenge is in the upfront costs.
Thank you. My time has expired, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, is now recognized.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Wickham, has your office studied the impact of the 75% electric vehicle mandate on the Postal Service's ability to implement the Delivering for America plan?
We have not studied a 75% requirement at all as a part of our work.
Do you have plans to study that?
We have not been asked to do that. We've been asked to do some additional work to look at the Postal Service's compliance with Nepa and its environmental impact statement, and that's what we're doing moving forward. But if that 75% request comes our way, we'll definitely take a look at it.
There was a post from the USPS Office of Inspector General's LinkedIn account promoting your testimony today. On this hearing, it said how the agency can acquire more electric vehicles. Are you here to promote electric vehicle purchases, or are you here as a nonpartisan witness?
I'm here as a nonpartisan witness.
Okay. I have a question for Mr. Stein. What we've seen in the past right now is car prices are going up dramatically. Used car prices are, I think, 40% higher. New cars, electric car prices are also going up. We have supply chain issues going on right now. The Biden administration's solution to high gas prices has been to tell everybody to buy an electric car, which for most people, that's out of their price range. Can you speak to the role that our supply chains play in obtaining necessary resources such as lithium, cobalt for battery-operated electric vehicles?
Right, so all these minerals we've been talking about are they go into the electric vehicle batteries, and they are the largest component of the cost of an electric vehicle. So as these prices skyrocket, and they have partly due to the war, but they also were rising even before on supply chain issues. So that directly translates into higher costs for electric vehicles. I think Tesla has raised their prices twice just this year because of these supply chain issues.
Okay. And has the Office of Inspector General, have you looked at kind of a more comprehensive approach of what this would mean as far as markets in general?
We have not looked at that. We looked specifically at the Postal Service and how the opportunities and challenges, it's kind of the paper that we published was kind of a higher level look at opportunities and challenges associated with electric vehicles at the Postal Service.
And what's the average expected lifespan for a battery in an electric vehicle, in these electric vehicles?
In our analysis, our model looked at 10 years.
At 10 years? And these need to last 20 years? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, our analysis had a 20-year lifespan. So one replacement of the battery.
Okay. And Mr. Stein, when it comes to batteries and when it comes to, I mean, there's a debate now on what should the right mix be between electric vehicles, whether it should be 20%, 75%. A lot of that's going to depend on the region, the routes. I live in, rural Texas, so the routes are a lot larger. The infrastructure is different, those kind of things. Also, there's can you speak to battery performance when it comes to regionally, when it comes to climate, when it comes to extreme hot and cold temperatures, seasonal, those kind of things?
Right, that's an important operational variable, and that's actually discussed in both the record of decision and the IG's report. And part of the problem is that that's very uncertain. We do know that in very hot and very cold temperatures, battery performance does degrade over time. But part of the problem is, as already been discussed, the post office has a very unique way of operating that an Amazon or a UPS, they don't do the same thing. So it's hard to even take from their lesson of how their batteries have worked. But even I think it was in the OIG report, they even found that a lot of the proposed ranges, the expected ranges, actually didn't come through. I think it was the German Deutsche Post had shorter ranges than they expected. Amazon had some shorter ranges, and that's because the actual operational use was different from the theoretical range. So I think that's part of what my point has been, being very cautious about introducing electric vehicles until we know how they actually perform in the use by the post office.
So you would advocate for a more gradual implementation? Is that what I'm getting at?
I think 20% is a little higher than I might go, but certainly no more than that.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We will be voting on the motion to subpoena in 5 minutes. So I now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, for her questions. And we will be voting in 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The global auto market stands at a crossroads today, and companies and countries alike are racing to see who will win the EV race. Mr. Britton, last year you said, and I quote, "The choices we face are stark. We either cultivate an advanced vehicle sector or cede this economic opportunity to others." You then explained how China's economy has captured the EV market, but that the U.S. has the opportunity to reclaim its leadership in this important transformation. Mr. Britton, can you say more about what's at stake in the global race for leadership in the EV market, and how are President Biden's policies helping the U.S. seize the opportunity?
Well, thank you for the question. I think we've heard a lot of talk about what other countries' capabilities are. I don't think it's the American way to look at strategic advantages that others have and then to shy away from that battle. We know how to compete, and we have won these fights before, and we know that consumers are going to be demanding electric vehicles. And so the opportunity before us is twofold. One is, are we able to meet those consumer demands with domestically manufactured vehicles by cultivating a strong industry? And then two, are we also able to drive the public benefits of both emissions reduction for climate change, but also public health? And so those two combinations are ones where we can drive multiple values and do it in a way that makes everybody better off. Even if you never get behind the wheel of an EV, the more electric vehicles on the road benefits workers in those plants, retail outlets in those communities, and then everybody who's breathing in pollution today. And one of the things that I'd mention is that we have many Americans, 40% of Americans are living in areas with subpar air quality that's hurting their public health. And if you're an American of color, you're 2 to 3 times likely to be part of that 40% that's breathing in pollution. And black and brown Americans, certainly in the mid-Atlantic, studies have shown breathe in 66% more of that pollution. So it's really important for us to look at the multitude of values that we can drive down, whether that's economic development in manufacturing or it's emissions reduction for both climate change and public health. Everybody can be better off.
Thank you. And how do federal purchasing decisions impact the domestic EV market? And how can we make sure that these purchasing decisions deliver the greatest benefit possible to the American people?
Well, I think the most important thing that we can do is send a signal that this is an area that the government, and the federal government in particular, is moving in. And the Biden administration has already offered an executive order that should be a clear signal to the Postal Service that this is a direction that they ought to be going. But really, it's, I don't think you even need to look. You could look past the manufacturing benefits, past the emissions reduction benefits. The Postal Service is set to save $4.3 billion if they electrify. It is more expensive to drive an internal combustion engine vehicle than an electric vehicle. And their model relies on a 50% discount on gasoline for the next 18 years. It then is taking the cost of a charger and inflating it by a magnitude of 10 and tripling the number of chargers that we need. And then they're assuming that the range of these vehicles are half of what they actually can achieve. And so if we had a model that reflected reality and was based in fact, it would be an easy answer and a no-brainer that is reflected in what their competitors are doing today. FedEx, Amazon, UPS, everybody is moving in this direction, not from an ESG sensibility, but because it's good for business and it's good for their bottom line.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens, does the Postal Service take these broader policy goals into consideration when deciding whether to purchase gas or electric versions of its next generation delivery vehicle?
Certainly they're in consideration, but they're also in the context of our Delivering for America plan and our internal resources and our need to be self-sustaining financially. So it's a balance of all of those factors.
Did the Postal Service conduct any data-driven studies to determine the optimal number of electric vehicles to purchase, yes or no?
Yes.
Well, can you provide the committee with the data and the study?
If it's protected and specifically requested through formal channels, we can follow up on that, yes.
And as we've heard, Mr. Britton, the purchase of EVs under President Biden's Made in America policies will reduce pollution, create jobs, advance U.S. leadership and innovation, and help make the U.S. a global leader in EV production. Ms. Nanmain, would you say that purchase of such EVs would be in the national interest of the United States?
Well, the purchasing power of the federal government is certainly can be a driver in the private markets.
I'm out of time. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. We will now consider the subpoena motion, and I now recognize Mr. Johnson.
I move to table.
All those in favor of tabling the motion of the gentleman say aye.
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 Those opposed say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is tabled. Okay. I now recognize Mr. Conley. Let's go to Ocasio.
Mr. DeSagne.
Mr. DeSagne? He's not up there. He's there. Mr. DeSagne, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for having this hearing. Wanted to ask all of the panelists, and thank you for being here today. Was able to get a bill with $7 billion into the transportation infrastructure bill for battery charging stations and fuel cell stations. So it strikes me that obviously the Postal Service, as a retail national sort of real estate asset, that looking at infrastructure as part of not just transitioning the fleet, and we've done a lot of work on this in California when I was on the Transportation Committee and when I was on CARB on fuel cells. Having a former Republican governor talked about the hydrogen highway. So my question is, how can we use the real estate assets not only to help the Postal Service electrify its fleet, but also to have charging and fuel cell stations at postal facilities? And I'll just let you answer that question in the order that you have testified.
Sure, I can go first and then go down the aisle. Obviously, the Postal Service has an extensive nationwide retail infrastructure. There are opportunities there, but there are also challenges with doing that. And I can move to Ms. Stevens. She can probably explain better some of the challenges associated with that, but there is an extensive infrastructure there that the Postal Service maintains.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and jump in as well. So we have more than 17,000 facilities where we're planning to, if we fully electrified our delivery fleet, where we would need some kind of charging infrastructure. We also have additional retail facilities beyond that quantity as well. So you're right, we definitely have a significant physical presence. One of the things that's important to us from a safety perspective and a security perspective is that all of our vehicles are what we call in the secured fence line. There are reasons for not only security, security of the mail to make sure that it's only authorized personnel in that space, but also for a safety perspective. There's moving vehicles, moving containers. So it's really important to us to consider this equation outside of that scope. So perhaps in the front end of the postal retail parking locations, for example. We're willing to have the discussions. We're absolutely willing to participate in those discussions. We do have concerns about making sure that we continue to have sufficiently available parking, especially during peak hours, for our retail customers who are coming to their local post office to transact with us. So that's important to us. And making sure that that there's a way to take this forward. We're happy to have those discussions and entertain those analyses and determine a place that we can help contribute. We understand the importance.
Thanks.
I'd say we have ongoing work that's looking at opportunities and challenges of using postal facilities as locations for public charging infrastructure. There could be a number of different use cases for that would make sense. There could be some cases where it may not make sense. There could be gaps in service in charging locations, for example, where a postal service facility could maybe fill that gap. But as Ms. Stevens mentioned, there are probably some challenges as well, the security and legal challenges, and we'll be looking at all of those in our ongoing work.
So one of the things that I would recommend, obviously diversifying the retail options for the Postal Service has been something of discussion and reform debates for years. But part of the capital upgrades for charging at some of the highest cost expense, so you could share the power delivery if you're trenching and delivering new power to a part of the Postal Service. Some of those chargers could be behind the fence, some could be in front of the fence for customers. And I think, excuse me, one of the areas that we want to set the Postal Service apart is for consumers. So we want there to be an additional incentive for them to choose the Postal Service over their other options. And so if there's charging, as more and more electric vehicles become part of the federal individual light-duty fleet, we want to meet them where they're at as consumers, and they're going to be shopping and obviously voting with their dollars. We want that to be with the Postal Service. We believe firmly in charging options, whether that's joint or something that is distinguished just for retail customers.
Thanks.
I'll mostly defer to the post office. They issued a lot of the issues, but the one thing I'll say, it does seem like the mission of the Postal Service is to deliver the mail, not to provide charging services. So it seems outside the scope of their job.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but there is hopefully we can be open-minded about effective and efficient delivery of public services, and I think we have real opportunities if we're open to that. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We now have Mr. Fallon, the gentleman from Texas. I believe he is remotely going to ask his questions. Mr. Fallon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. You know, electric vehicles aren't the magic bullet that so many claim they are, and we have to consider certain things. The mining of the rare earth materials, and that in and of itself exhausts a tremendous amount of energy. In the mining process, a significant amount of greenhouse gases are emitted. And a lot of these processes in the mining occurs in countries where health and safety and environmental standards and precautions are dramatically less stringent than they would be here in the United States or in other developed nations. The battery production for the BEVs also have an environmental impact, and it should be noted that about 2 to 2.5 times emissions are generated when you produce a BEV rather than a battery than you would in a combustion engine. And then how the electricity is generated to actually charge the BEV needs to be considered. We know that coal-powered plants, of course, are least ideal. We have hundreds of those in the United States alone, and it's estimated that upwards of 60% of the electric grid in our country is powered by fossil fuels. So it's almost 2/3 chance when you plug in that car to charge, it's being charged ironically by fossil fuels. And, you know, studies have shown with the battery electric vehicles, the BEVs, may be responsible for greater human toxicity and ecosystems effects than their ICEV equivalents due to the mining and the processing of the material, of the metals to produce the batteries, and as we just mentioned, the mining and the combustion of coal to produce the electricity. And most BEVs rely on lithium-ion batteries, which are made from critical materials, including, as we talked about earlier, cobalt, graphite, lithium. So, Mr. Stein, I'm sure you're aware that most estimates determine that the People's Republic of China produces 85% of rare earth resources, 40% of the world's copper, 30% of the world's nickel, and controls 70% of the world's cobalt refining capacity, and nearly 60% of the world's lithium. Would you agree that the U.S. must secure battery-related resource supply chains as a matter of national security?
Certainly, if our goal as a country is to change over to electric vehicles, then yes, we absolutely need to secure those resources, because if we're talking about national security, we don't want to just exchange buying foreign oil from buying foreign batteries. So a national security point should be to have these things produced domestically.
So if we don't secure that, as you just mentioned, rather than we're just really kind of trading exchanging, I should say, one trading master for another, whether it's Saudi Arabia and OPEC, as opposed to, China. Would that be fair statement?
Sure, and ironically, the last 10 years, we actually have largely weaned ourselves off of the oil coming from these countries that hate us. So we have just finally gotten to that point, and now we're talking about returning to dependence on another country that hates us.
So maybe in just vernacular, several steps forward and then even more steps back if we went this route.
Right. It's 2 steps forward, 4 steps back.
Yeah. And then are you also aware, Mr. Stein, that China owns or finances 15 of the 19 cobalt-producing mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which contains 60% of the world's cobalt?
Yes, that sounds correct.
So the last question I have for you is, why would our Democratic friends be pushing for more electric vehicles in the U.S. Post Office fleet when they have not secured the supply chain and the supply lines for resources critical to the EV production?
Well, I think it's just an ideological commitment to electric vehicles. This is the same problem that we have with the ideological commitment to wind and solar generation, even though those resources are, again, coming from outside the United States. It's about outsourcing these environmental harms to other countries so that we can pretend that we are environmentally virtuous.
Because we're just not there yet, are we, from a technological standpoint? I mean, we may get there someday, we're just not there yet. It's not as efficient right now as the old, nasty combustion engine vehicle seems to actually be more environmentally friendly when you consider all things than an electric vehicle, at least today. Is that a fair statement?
It depends on what weight you put in different parts of the manufacturing process. Certainly at the tailpipe, ICE vehicles produce more emissions than an electric vehicle, obviously, but what value, how many emissions is it worth to have child slave labor in the Congo? That's not a one-to-one comparison. It becomes a moral trade-off. Like, what do you prefer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Brenda Lawrence, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Stevens, I would like to ask a few questions about the internal discussions related to the public-facing electric vehicle charging stations. In your testimony, you referenced that the USPS role is not yet clearly defined as part of the public-facing infrastructure. So my question is, has the Postal Service been involved in discussion with other federal agencies about the role the Postal Service can play in this conversation in a proactive manner, as opposed to waiting for direction?
The short answer to that is no. We've certainly had discussions with various congressional staff members exploring the idea. We've not engaged other agencies to pursue that.
And why is that? Why haven't you?
Yeah, as Mr. Stein pointed out, it's not part of our core mission. Our core mission is delivering mail and making sure that we have the infrastructure to support our operational needs for the electric vehicles that we take forward through this process. So we consider it beyond that remit.
Well, I just want to push back on that, because your core mission isn't about dog bites, but the reality of what has happened, and even safety of our carriers on the road. I mean, life dictates what your priorities are, and I would hope the Postal Service understands the need for a priority when it comes to being a part of the solution for our carbon footprint. From an implementation standpoint, what are some of the logistical challenges the Postal Service face? How could we, as Congress, help you address some of these concerns? Do you need us to give you direction to make this one of your priorities? And I would like to hear your comment on that.
Okay, yeah, certainly. I think in terms of constraints, one of the top constraints would be that we're not even sure that within statute that we have the right to establish this kind of a service. This would not fall into postal products and supplies. It does not fall neatly into the definitions of the types of products and services that we offer. So there is some opportunity to assess what needs to be done legally to enable that. We would not find it within the statute that controls that today. From an implementation perspective, some of the challenges are just understanding what the administration and Congress is seeking to achieve. If the goal is to set up, to reduce range anxiety, for example, that might lead to a different set of conclusions than just having a charging station at every nearby postal facility. So I think—
So, Ms. Stevens, I have to ask this question. We passed the Postal Service Reform Act,
yes,
providing the agency additional areas of revenue while providing service to the public. We know that we've had conversation about banking, about permits and other things,
yes,
that are not within the core function of the Postal Service, but is a revenue stream. And so have you had internal conversations about using these public-facing stations as additional funding system?
We have had a preliminary evaluation. We do not think that the public charging capabilities fall within what we can provide as other postal products and services. So our initial read on the matter is that it's beyond our scope, it's beyond our purview.
Madam Chair, I would really like to continue this discussion and to make sure that we're on the same page with the Postal Service, because one of the things they wanted was opportunity to have additional funding opportunities. And if you're going to have an fleet and it's sitting there idle, the charging station, and you can have opportunity to get additional funding. So I'll yield back, but I want you to know that's something I want to explore. Thank you.
I thank the lady for her questions. You raised really good points, and it was certainly my understanding along the line of your understanding that, of course, this would be covered in the additional services that they could provide. But let us keep on with the hearing. Mr. Conley, you are now recognized.
I thank the chair, and I'm sorry, I got multiple hearings, and I got a bill on the floor, so I'm running around. So please forgive me for not being able to be here the whole time. Ms. Whitcomb, you're the Inspector General of the Postal Service, is that correct?
Yes.
You might turn, yeah. We heard a little earlier that the assumption about the price of gas in looking at costing the benefits of a fossil fuel fleet versus an EV fleet was assumed to be $2.19. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what we heard earlier, yes.
I'm having trouble hearing you. Can you?
Sorry, I'll scoot up.
Thank you.
Thing is on, yes.
There you go.
Yeah, is
That's
that
better. Thank you.
Yeah, my understanding is that was the gas price at the time the Postal Service did its initial assumptions.
Yeah.
So,
But they project that out.
right.
So what is the current cost of gasoline on average in the United States, do you know?
So it's between $4 and $5, I believe.
So almost twice what they're assuming already. And of course, we can't see the future. Maybe it will come down to $2.19. Maybe it will go up. In California, for example, there's also variability in the states. In California, I believe the average cost of a gallon of gasoline right now is hovering around $6. That your understanding?
Yes.
So when the Postal Service says, well, in looking at the cost benefit, over 20 years, the operating costs for a gas fleet will be $9.3 billion, and the operating costs for an electric fleet will be $11.6 billion. That's predicated on an assumption we now know to be, at the very least, subject to great variation at any given time. Is that correct?
Yeah, if the $2.19 is what that's relying upon, I would agree with you there. And these assumptions change, and that's why modeling is so important, so that you can put in different assumptions and adjust.
Yes, that's right. What you assume can determine the outcome.
Right.
And I'm very worried about the assumptions that went in or didn't go in to the environmental report that the Postal Service came up with, gasoline being one of them. Let's talk about maintenance. What were the assumptions about the contrast of the cost of maintenance of a gasoline, diesel fleet versus an EV fleet? Do you know?
I don't know specifically. I do know that from what we've heard from other witnesses that the maintenance costs were assumed to be higher for an electric vehicle fleet in the Postal Service's model. We did not analyze that in our work. Our model projected those maintenance costs to be lower.
Lower,
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So and I'm going to give you an opportunity, Ms. Stevens, but that is of concern to me too. What were the assumptions about maintenance? Anyone who owns an electric vehicle will tell you that the maintenance costs for an EV are lower than what they paid or would pay for a gasoline or diesel-fueled vehicle. Ms. Stevens, did you want to comment on that? I want to give you an opportunity to comment.
Absolutely, I'd be pleased to. So first of all, the $2.19 data point.
Well, we're going to move on beyond that for a
All
minute.
right.
I thought you wanted to talk about maintenance.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to talk
Yeah.
about all of it.
Yeah.
In terms
I don't
of-
mean to cut you off. I just have limited time.
It's okay. In terms of the maintenance costs, that data has been misunderstood by others who've had access to the data within the model. The maintenance ratio of an ICE vehicle versus a BEV vehicle for us in our analysis shows that it's 8% lower. So that's a data point that's been misunderstood in the way that it's been represented. It is lower. A BEV takes less maintenance. It has less moving systems, so it's lower. It's just not been understood correctly in the data. It's also important to note that our costs reflect we're moving from 30-year-old vehicles with hardly any systems up to a new standard. So there is additional maintenance.
Believe me, I know. I've been working on this issue for 14 years.
Yes.
And I've been championing trying to replace the vehicle fleet. I will say to you, historically, in 2009, Ruth Goldberg, who was then the head of the Postal Regulatory Commission, came to see me saying, what if we earmark some of the stimulus money, $3 billion at that time, to replace the fleet? And the then Postmaster General used the same language Mr. Comer used. We don't want to be guinea pigs. And he rejected a $3 billion earmark to replace the entire fleet with a hybrid fleet. And here we are 12 years later making the same arguments and having the same discussion. And I worry, we obviously can't afford another 30 years of a obsolete fossil-fueled vehicular fleet. And that is my concern about the decision that's been made. In about 15 years, those vehicles will be obsolete. I have run out of time. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very, very much for your questions and your hard work in this area. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for the hearing. Just to piggyback, no pun intended, on what was just said by Representative Connolly. The Post Office has the opportunity not to be a guinea pig here, but to be a trailblazer. And that's I think, what is creating a lot of the anxiety on our side of the aisle, is the lost opportunity here for the U.S. Postal Service to really lead the way when it comes to clean, efficient energy vehicles and addressing climate change. We know we've got to take immediate action on this front. Every report that comes out kind of on a 6-week basis shows that the problem is accelerating. So the federal government should be a leader in reducing emissions and transitioning to greener technologies. Quick advertisement here. That's why I was proud last year to introduce the Federal Building Clean Jobs Act, which is another example of where the federal government and associated agencies can be trailblazers. That would require federal agencies to meet bolder energy and emission goals for their physical spaces by 2030. But this hearing today about the Postal Service's investment is obviously critical, and I want to compare the decision that Postal Service has made in this space to the aspirations that the President, and I would say our country, is laying out at this moment. In his first week of office, President Biden recommitted us to the goals of reducing our emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. So, Ms. Stevens, the Postal Service, as we've discussed at length here today, recently purchased 50,000 vehicles, only 10,000 of which will be electric. Do you believe that the Postal Service's current procurement plan of relying on gas-powered delivery vehicles for the next 20 years lives up to the national commitment that President Biden has articulated there?
It is the best that the Postal Service can elicit, given the resources that we have available today. We'd love to do more. We simply don't have the resources. We need to make good on our Delivering for America plan and the execution of all of those other capital and strategies as well. We're balancing both and trying to do the best that we can within our given resources to meet the intent of those initiatives.
President Biden also issued an executive order calling for, quote, clean and zero emission vehicles for government fleets, including vehicles of the United States Postal Service. Ms. Stevens, again, are the internal combustion engine delivery vehicles that make up 80% of the recent order that was placed by the Postal Service, quote, clean and zero emission? I think I know the answer, but go ahead.
So my understanding of both of those executive orders, in the OMB's implementation memorandum, they strongly encouraged the Postal Service to meet the goals, and we are doing everything that we can to meet those goals. There was not a mandate for us in that. It was strongly encouraged, and we're responding in the best way we can within our resources.
Last August, alongside auto executives, UAW leadership, President Biden issued another executive order calling for half of the new cars and trucks sold by 2030 to be electric. On Friday, the Transportation Department issued new fuel economy standards requiring efficiency gains of 8% in both 2024 and 2025, followed by a 10% increase in 2026, and further requiring that passenger cars and light trucks achieve about 49 miles per gallon. Ms. Stevens, yes or no, will the Postal Service commit to ensuring that all next generation delivery vehicles it purchases by 2026 get at least 49 miles per gallon?
I don't think I have the information today to make that commitment.
Well, it's a difficult one to make given the decision tree that we are discussing here today. And look, I understand the Postal Service is independent and, you know, is not directly under the authority of the President and the administration the way some other agencies are. But responding to the climate crisis requires an all-of-government and all-of-society approach. And I just think that, I mean, I understand the constraints you're talking about, but I think there was a way, and we're going to continue to pursue whether there's a way for the U.S. Postal Service to stretch and reach for more ambitious goals when it comes to these clean energy and energy efficient vehicles. So we're going to continue to press on you. Thank you very much for your testimony today. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you for your questions today. And we now go to the gentleman from Illinois. Mr. Davis, you are now recognized. Mr. Davis. We can't hear you. Your mic is not on. We can't hear you. Who else can we go to? There seems to be a technical problem in reaching Mr. Davis. The gentlelady from New York. Nope. Did he get on her? Okay. Mr. Davis. Well, can we go to...
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think I'm okay now. Thank you, Madam Chairman. The Government Accountability Office and to all the rest who are present, let me just say thank you. GAO has outlined clear concerns about the methodologies used by the Postal Service when developing its total cost of the ownership model. We've spent a lot of time today talking about what the Postal Service needs to correct with its existing purchase order and contracts. Now I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss what the Postal Service should do moving forward to ensure that future acquisitions are done more effectively and efficiently. Ms. Nemain, GAO has spent significant time reviewing the Postal Service's methodologies and analysis. What should the Postal Service do to improve its analysis in future acquisitions?
Well, we are still completing our work, so we don't have final recommendations yet. But one of the things that we'll be looking at and asking the Postal Service about is their process for updating their model. We've heard that they've made some updates, and we understand that. So one of the things we want to understand further is what kind of process there is to institutionalize updating those assumptions and information in the model to make sure that they are the best possible information so that the results that come out of the model are reflective of current market conditions or technological advances. So before another order is placed, for example, that the information is as sound and accurate and reliable as possible.
Thank you very much, Ms. Whitcomb. Let me ask the same question to you.
Yes, I think we are are similarly to Ms. Navon, we are in the process of doing work on the Postal Service's assumptions and how those assumptions were used in preparing the environmental impact statement. And so we will be also looking for things like sensitivity analysis and other things, looking for ranges of assumptions, not just individual assumptions, and the ability for a model to be agile enough to adjust to the significant, I guess, disruptions in the energy sector that we've seen recently, both on the electric vehicle battery components that you heard a lot about today, as well as the prices of gasoline, which are both kind of really have been disrupted recently.
Ms. Whitcomb, let me just ask, I'm specifically concerned about the way the Postal Service went about the Nepa process. What can the service do in the future to ensure that it is complying with both the letter and the spirit of the law with respect to Nepa?
Yeah, it's something that we are looking at right now, and we will definitely be evaluating the Postal Service's compliance with NEPA as a part of that work. And if we see issues there, we will be making recommendations to ensure that that happens.
Thank you both very much, and thank you, Madam Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I think, hopefully, all of us are interested in the Postal Service being able to electrify its fleet as quickly as possible, as rationally and as feasible as possible. So I thank you very much for this hearing, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Mfume, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate you holding this hearing. I want to thank you and Representative Conley specifically for your work in this ongoing effort to try to make sense out of what I consider to be a nonsensical position from Mr. DeJoy and the U.S. Postal Service. Ms. Stevens, since everybody has been coming at you for questions and comments and observations, I'm going to try to do the same thing here, not to pick up on you, but to try to get more information. I understand, as has been said several times, that the U.S. Postal Service Office of the Inspector General found that the cost of an electric vehicle over 20 years would be 8.5% lower than that projected of a gas-powered vehicle and the cost of that vehicle. And yet, as has been stated here several times, Postmaster General DeJoy still argues that electric vehicles are not cost-effective, which sounds like fuzzy math to me. When you have the numbers to prove that they are, then you almost deny those numbers. You're not a heart surgeon, and you're certainly not a brain surgeon, but Postmaster DeJoy wants to position the service, the Postal Service, to compete with companies, as he says, such as UPS, FedEx, Amazon, and as has been stated, all three of which have made aggressive efforts to electrify their fleets. Those are who we're going to be competing with now and into the future. So if you could, rather subjectively, give again some sort of explanation as to why the Postal Service is only allocating 10,000 of the 50,000 in its initial order with Oshkosh, I would appreciate your comments and your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to address that. I think the findings of the OIG, we were really pleased when they took a look at our total cost of ownership model and developed their own model independently to see some consistency, and perhaps we'd be able to hear from the OIG on that as well. What the OIG's findings revealed were very, very similar to the Postal Service's modeling efforts. When we look at the entire fleet, there is not, over the course of the 20-year life of the asset, even though it's the fuel is cheaper, and in theory the maintenance is also cheaper over that period of time, the savings from fuel and maintenance benefits is not sufficient to overcome the higher investment value that's required for electric vehicles. And so
okay, I kind of thought you were going to say that. So
yeah.
let me point out something else, if there's no cost difference there. Congress has helped the Postal Service fill its coffers with billions of dollars in the last few years. So if there was any shortfall, there is none now. In 2020, this Congress approved an emergency $10 billion pandemic relief act to your organization. And just this year, Congress passed Chairwoman Maloney's Postal Service Reform Act, which will relieve the Postal Service of $107 billion in past due amounts and future payments. So my current understanding is that the agency has right now $24 billion in cash, according to information provided by the Treasury. If that is so, why does the Postal Service and Mr. DeJoy continue to argue that it's too expensive to increase the proportion of electric vehicles in its order with Oshkosh? Could you speak to that?
Certainly. It has to do with our Delivering for America plan, our strategic objectives and priorities. The vehicle fleet implementation is a portion of those priorities and funding requests, but it's a small portion by comparison. We've deferred maintenance, we've deferred investments. It's not just our vehicles that are long overdue to be replaced. There are structural, infrastructure-related things that are part of what the Postal Service requires to operate effectively and efficiently and over the course of decades to come.
Thank you. I want to reclaim my time. What we can't defer is what's happening in terms of the health of Americans as a result of an enlarging carbon footprint that now the United States Postal Service, which operates 1/3 of all the vehicles in the inventory of the United States government, continues to ignore or delay or to put aside the issues that deal with health. I have here a report from the American Lung Association, which points out the dangers of going down the path that the Postal Service is currently on by refusing to electrify its vehicles into the future. And they talk about asthma, they talk about lung cancer in communities, wheezing and coughing, shortness of breath among children, and the cardiovascular harm. I could go through a long list of things. This is one thing we can't defer. We cannot assume that people can still get sick, chronically or otherwise, because we don't have the foresight to recognize the real benefits in moving over time, like FedEx and Amazon and UPS, toward electrical vehicles. So it breaks my heart that there are these reasons which don't stand the test in terms of the truth, and reasons that are being put forth to this committee repeatedly about why it's okay to, again, get all of these gas guzzlers for the next 20 years, putting pollutants into the air, affecting the health of people, and engaging us in a cost that could be, as you said, deferred or certainly tamped down. So I'm adamantly opposed to the position of
the gentleman's time has expired, and without objection, your report will be put in the record. The gentle lady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is now recognized.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Stevens, in March of this year, the U.S. Postal Service placed its first order of next-generation delivery vehicles with Oshkosh Defense. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what was that contract, that initial contract, valued at?
I think it's been covered in the press. It's $2.98 billion for 50,000 vehicles.
So nearly a $3 billion contract that the United States Postal Service presently has with a defense contractor in order to produce these internal combustion engine vehicles. Largely. The initial order is for 50,000 next-generation delivery vehicles, but from what I understand, only about 10,000 are actually required to be battery electric vehicles. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So to summarize, the USPS has contracted with Oshkosh Defense and is giving them $3 billion to build around 50,000 vehicles, 10,000 of which must be battery powered. Now, I think one note and element of context that's important to mention is that this committee has a long bipartisan history of oversight, particularly when it comes to defense contracting. This is one of the very few things that we've been able to agree upon in the past. Even when former ranking member Mark Meadows was here, this was something that that concerned him. And I hope that our current ranking member, we can continue to find agreement there. Now, Ms. Steven, and I will say one thing about Oshkosh Defense, is that they're union. They have union labor. Ms. Steven, would you say that part of the reason, and it was an important consideration for Oshkosh Defense that they had a unionized workforce, that the United States and the USPS would be contracting with them to potentially work and fulfill this contract?
The solicitation from the Postal Service requires domestic production only. It does not require particular locations or workforce.
Yes, but was it a favorable element? Did Oshkosh mention this? Was it something that was considered? You know, there are many different contractors that are capable of domestic production.
Sure.
And the president has very clearly indicated a preference for union labor in domestic production.
It is not a contract requirement, therefore it was not an evaluation criteria or considered.
So it was not considered at all.
It was not considered in the decision.
As I understand, Oshkosh Defense does have multiple manufacturing facilities in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, that are made to build military vehicles, correct?
Military and other.
And they have a long history, an established history of this. We have heard from workers on the ground that Oshkosh Defense has the capacity to build these vehicles in their existing facilities in Wisconsin. Yet we're starting to see some troubling reports. Madam Chair, for the record, I would like to submit two reports, one from the Journal-Times and the other from the Herald Journal. Spartanburg fights back to keep Oshkosh Defense Postal Fleet project, and why Oshkosh Corp didn't build USPS vehicles in a Foxconn facility in Mount Pleasant.
Without objection.
I'd also like to submit to the record a letter from members of this committee regarding concern about the fact that Oshkosh Defense is now moving their facilities after they have won the contract.
Without objection.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens, are you aware that the announcement that next generation delivery vehicle fleet would be built in South Carolina after the Oshkosh Defense initially won the contract in having facilities in Wisconsin?
Yeah, the Postal Service was made aware of that decision shortly before the public announcement, and it is a decision that's at the discretion of the supplier.
So are you aware that Oshkosh Defense might be trying to circumvent its longstanding contract with the United Auto Workers workforce in Wisconsin by essentially building a brand new facility after the contract was awarded in a vacant warehouse in South Carolina?
I have no awareness of that, but I would encourage you to have that conversation with Oshkosh.
Is the USPS troubled by this timeline at all?
By what was that?
By this timeline at all?
Which timelines are you referring to?
The timeline of the fact that NextGen, they had secured Oshkosh. Oshkosh presented the contract with their existing facilities. They have union labor. They were granted a $3 billion contract under the USPS under the leadership of DeJoy. And then after the ink was dry, it looks like they're opening up a scab facility in South Carolina with no prior history of producing vehicles in that facility.
So I think some of the facts about what was represented in a proposal are not correct, and I would disagree with those assertions.
Okay, and so I would say that the USPS is not troubled by that timeline.
I would agree with your statement.
Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize our last speaker, my colleague in Congress, Congressman Huffman, who has developed several pieces of legislation on this issue and worked with the committee on it. Thank you for being here for the whole hearing. You are now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Chair Maloney, thanks so much for allowing me to participate and for holding this important hearing. I have been leading the charge for postal fleet electrification along with my friend Representative Connolly for nearly a decade now. I'm proud to be co-sponsoring the Postal Vehicle Modernization Act with you, Chair Maloney, and with Representative Connolly. And I'm sorry that Congress may have to legislate common sense, the same common sense that has led all of the Postal Service's private sector competitors to move quickly to all EV fleets without asking Congress for any money to do it. As we've heard from several expert witnesses, the business case for doing this is a no-brainer. In fact, with EV costs declining, EV technology improving, gas prices soaring, and vehicle manufacturers moving away from internal combustion, it would be really hard to cook up a model or a business case that favors lumbering internal combustion vehicles that get an average of 8.6 miles per gallon over EVs, the same EVs that are going to be powering fleets at FedEx, Amazon, UPS, and DHS. But that's exactly what the Postal Service did with this contract and this program, calling for vehicles that are built for obsolescence. They will literally be the last internal combustion fleet vehicles on the road 20 years from now. So, Ms. Stephen, you testified that Postal Service's sensitivity analysis on gas prices let you double the initial order of EVs to just over 10,000. Does this mean that you're also doubling the total fleet purchase from 10% to 20%?
When you refer to the total fleet purchase, are you referring to the 50,000? Just so that I'm clear.
The entire contract, the entire contract.
No, this is specific to this initial investment decision. We've made
Thank you.
Contract for 50.
That's what I thought. And if the only change is a slight increase to the initial order, it is hard to see how this sensitivity analysis has really changed much. It seems more like a reaction to the public criticism and political pressure that you've been getting over buying vehicles that'll get 8.6 miles to the gallon. Ms. Nemani, you testified that under the model GAO reviewed, the Postal Service was showing higher maintenance costs for EVs. Ms. Stephen just testified that that's incorrect. It misunderstands the data. And so let me ask you, were you correct when you said after reviewing the USPS model, it showed higher maintenance costs for EVs?
This is one of the inconsistencies that we've seen in the information that we've gotten so far from the Postal Service. Some of the information, including what Ms. Stevens said today, is that the maintenance costs would be less for electric vehicles. However, when we looked at the formula in the model itself, in the Excel spreadsheet that we've received of the model, we don't see that in that formula. We see a different amount that's used in that model that indicates that the maintenance costs would be higher. So there's definitely, it's an iterative process, our ongoing work, and we'll get additional information from the Postal Service and make our final conclusions.
I appreciate that. Mr. Britton, in your colloquy with Representative Wasserman Schultz, you highlighted another important discrepancy, the assumption by the Postal Service that the start and stop nature of many routes favored internal combustion engines, when in fact it's a strong selling point for EVs, correct?
That's correct.
And then there's the problem with the Postal Service assumptions about EV range, a 70-mile vehicle range. In your extensive work in this field, including the vehicles that companies like GM, Ford, and Rivian are providing to private fleets, did USPS use the correct assumption about battery range?
No, it is far inconsistent with what we're seeing in the marketplace, and I'll give you a couple examples. The Ford E-Transit van gets nearly 2 miles per kilowatt hour in the battery pack. The Workhorse C-Series gets 1.5 miles per kilowatt hour in the battery pack. The Arrival van that is being contracted with UPS gets 1.7 miles per kilowatt hour in the battery pack. The USPS assumption is that this vehicle gets 0.7 of a mile per kilowatt hour in the battery pack. The only other vehicle that we have seen that has that inefficient of an electric drivetrain would be a Class 8 tractor trailer or semi-truck fully weighted down. It is impossible that a last mile delivery truck.
And if the model used the correct range assumptions, wouldn't that significantly affect the total cost of ownership analysis, including the number of charging stations needed to support these vehicles?
That's correct. You would not need nearly as many charging stations as the Postal Service is asserting.
And Ms. Nemani, you also flagged another problem that the Postal Service initially didn't account for the amount of air conditioning used in the real world. And when you correct for that, the performance drops to 8.6 miles to the gallon on average, correct?
Right, that's another thing that we saw in the model that we've received from the Postal Service, that the fuel efficiency used was around 15 miles per gallon, which is the efficiency when the air conditioning isn't running, and it's less when the air conditioning is running. We've heard from the Postal Service that there is another place in the model that may account for the use of the air conditioning, and so that's something else that we'll be continuing to look at in our ongoing work.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have learned a lot today about errors and discrepancies that seem to go right to the heart of this unusual decision that is so at odds with what the private sector is doing. Thanks so much for this important hearing.
Well, thank you for waving on and all of your hard work, along with all the committee members on this issue. Thank you so much. You made a very valuable contribution. I would now like to submit for the record an important statement from Senator Carper on this critical hearing, so ordered. And I would like to submit to the record a new UN report. It literally came out just yesterday that makes clear that divesting from fossil fuels is critical. And they warned that without immediate action shifting from fossil fuels, we will not be able to keep global warming to acceptable levels. So this is a critically important report. I urge everyone to read it, and without objection, it now becomes part of our record. I would now like to call upon my colleague, thank him again for his valuable input on the reform bill for the post office, for his closing statement.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here. And I want to be very clear. Republicans do not oppose electric vehicles. In fact, we do not oppose electrifying some of the U.S. postal fleet. We raise a very valid concern, and I appreciate Mr. Stein's testimony today and the questions he answered. The policies of the Biden administration and his son Hunter have put us at a severe competitive disadvantage to China in the world battery market, which is essential to electrifying the postal fleet and electrifying the everyday average vehicle. It's a worthy cause to try to transfer from fossil fuels to electric vehicles, but the policies in the Biden administration are making that even more difficult than the economics of it. For example, the Biden administration war on coal is making it more difficult to mine coal and to burn coal. I know that from being from a coal-burning state and a coal-producing state. You have to have coal to make electricity. You also have to have natural gas to make electricity. We have a lot of problems with our energy policy in America from the Biden administration. And it's going to make electrifying vehicles even more difficult. I know a lot of Democrats think that if the average American's upset with the high prices of gasoline, due primarily to the Biden administration policy, then the solution's very simple. According to the Democrats, just go buy an electric vehicle. We don't have the infrastructure to electrify the fleet, and I appreciate the Inspector General, and I look forward to working with you in the future on postal issues. She mentioned in her testimony that in some of her analysis, it was cheaper in some areas to electrify the vehicle. I'm going to go out on a limb and say those were the urban areas. And my colleagues on the left that are advocating for electrifying the postal fleet and mentioned the private sector, UPS and FedEx, and electrifying some of their fleet, those are in the cities. If you close your eyes and you imagine the presidential map of the last 4 presidential elections, you see blue on the East Coast, blue on the West Coast, and a few blue dots around America. Then the rest of that map is red. That red area, like where I represent, where we represent, we just don't believe that those rural areas are ready and have the infrastructure for the postal fleet to be electrified. The routes are longer. There are many more challenges than in the more compact urban areas. So we have a long way to go in America to electrify the postal fleet. Besides, this committee's jurisdiction and this committee's role, Madam Chair, is to save money.
but yet every policy and every committee hearing from my friends on the left involves spending more money. When the government spends too much money, we have this thing called inflation. That's another challenge we have in America. And lastly, the role of the Postal Service right now, we need to focus on delivering the mail on time and doing it at a break-even cost. That's why we supported the postal reform bill. I'm very excited about the bill signing ceremony tomorrow, Madam Chair. Very excited about the Postal Service. I think many of you know my grandmother spent her whole career as a mail carrier, a rural mail carrier. I love the post office, committed to saving the post office. But we need to focus on improving the performance at the post office and trying to get the post office to operate at a break-even level, because Congress is not going to continue to provide bailouts to the Postal Service. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back and look forward to many more discussions about the Postal Service in the future.
The gentleman yields back, and I thank him for his participation today. I want to thank everyone who participated. As we heard today, the Postal Service can and must increase the number of electric vehicles that it purchases. As the United Nations warned just yesterday, couldn't be more on point for what we're talking about today at this hearing. The time to combat climate change is absolutely now. And the best way to do it is that to burn less oil and gas. And the Postal Service cannot ignore its responsibility to reduce the environmental impact of its fleet. The United Nations says if we don't do this, we are facing dire, dire consequences. And relying on gas guzzlers is also bad for business, which is why the major automakers, the private sector, and the Postal Service's competitors are all moving to electric vehicles. Most of them already have. We've heard from our witnesses today, including the nonpartisan GAO, that the Postal Service based its decision to buy tens of thousands of gas-guzzling trucks on faulty, wrong assumptions. The Postal Service used gas prices that are just half of what they are today and climbing. They claimed electric vehicles cost more to maintain than gas trucks. I've never heard that anywhere, except for in the testimony today. The exact opposite of the evidence and the science and really the testimonies of everybody here today. And they ignored the benefit of lower emissions from taking thousands of gasoline engines off the road, improving our environment, and the scientists are saying this will save lives of Americans. I am very pleased and thankful to the Post Office and their services today, and Ms. Stevens in her testimony. Thank you for committing to provide this committee with the analysis that the Post Office used to determine how many EVs to purchase. But it's clear that the Post Office needs to go back to the drawing board. Today, I call on the Postal Service to listen to the concerns of the Inspector General, the EPA, the GAO, and this entire committee, and conduct a new environmental impact study and a new cost estimate for electric vehicles. And if Oshkosh is overcharging the Postal Service for EVs, they should immediately renegotiate to a better price for America. Finally, let me briefly respond to the repeated attempts by my Republican colleagues to hijack this hearing to score cheap political points that have nothing to do with health, environment, or Postal Service. I will not play that political game. I intend to keep this committee focused on delivering for the American people. I will not relent until the Postal Service finally follows the private sector's lead and begins a real transition to an electric fleet. Going electric is imperative for our environment, for the Postal Service's bottom line, and for our national security at a time when Putin is using fossil fuels to finance atrocities against the people in Ukraine. I want to sincerely thank all of my colleagues who participated today and each of the witnesses for your valuable testimony, your productive conversation. And I would say that we as a committee, we as a Congress, we as a country have a singular opportunity right now before us to choose to reduce our dependence on fossil fuel, lower our cost, protect our economy, and help save the planet. What's not to like about going to electric vehicles? There's so many wins for our country. I want to thank everybody, and in closing, I want to thank particularly our panelists again for their remarks, and I want to commend my colleagues for participating in this important conversation. And with that, without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing is adjourned.